bucket slipped from Mira's hands the moment she heard footsteps at the gate. Not ordinary footsteps. These were different. They hit the ground with a kind of certainty that made the air around them feel smaller, like everything nearby had to make room. She did not look up. She kept her eyes on the stone floor she had been scrubbing for the past 2 hours, her knees aching, her fingers red from the cold water. She had learned a long time ago that looking up only invited trouble. The footsteps stopped. A low murmur passed through the compound like wind through tall grass, that soft, rippling sound that a crowd makes when something important has arrived. Mira moved her brush in slow circles, cleaning the same patch of stone she had already cleaned 3 times. She was good at making herself invisible. She had practiced it for 14 years. The Blackwood Pack compound sat on the edge of a wide valley in the northern hills, a cluster of stone buildings surrounded by old walls that had been repaired so many times no one could tell which parts were original anymore. It was a busy place, full of wolves who knew exactly where they stood in the world. At the top were the alphas, strong, loud, always the first into any room. Below them were the betas, the deltas, the ranked wolves who kept the pack running. And at the very bottom, barely worth mentioning, were the omegas. Mira was an omega. She had been told so since she was 7 years old, when she arrived at the compound with no family, no name that anyone recognized, and no explanation for where she had come from. Someone had given her the designation the way you would stamp a document, quickly, without much thought, just to file her somewhere so she didn't cause confusion. The stamp had never been removed. For 14 years she had cleaned floors. She had carried wood, she had washed dishes and mended clothes and been the last one allowed to sit at the table, and the first one called when something unpleasant needed doing. She had learned to eat quickly and sleep lightly, and keep her opinions behind her teeth. She had learned that the pack only noticed her when something went wrong, and that the safest thing she could be was a pair of hands that worked without complaint. What she had also learned, though this was a lesson she kept entirely to herself, was that the world around her sometimes did what she wanted without being asked. Small things. A candle that should have gone out in the wind stayed lit in her hands. A cut on her palm that should have taken a week to heal was gone by morning. Seeds she planted grew faster than they should, curling out of the soil in days instead of weeks. Injured birds that landed near her recovered and flew away without anyone touching them. She had no name for what she could do. She had no explanation. She only knew that it happened, and that she could not afford to let anyone see it. The compound gate was fully open now. She could hear the sound of horses, the creak of cartwheels, the sharp commands of guards directing traffic. Whoever was arriving, they had brought a considerable number of people with them. Mira moved her bucket 3 feet to the left and kept scrubbing. Get up. A foot nudged her bucket. Not hard, but not gentle either. Mira looked up. Nora, one of the senior omegas who reported directly to the head housekeeper, stood over her with the tight expression she always wore when she felt important. Nora was 10 years older than Mira, and used that seniority like a tool. The Alpha King is arriving, Nora said. You are not supposed to be visible. Take your bucket to the back storage room and stay there until someone calls for you. Mira opened her mouth. She closed it again. There was nothing to say that would change anything. She picked up her bucket and her brush, straightened her back, and walked the long way around the inner courtyard, keeping close to the walls. As she moved, she let herself take one glance at the gate. She could not help it. He was there. She could see him from across the courtyard, past 2 rows of pack members who had lined up to receive him. He was tall, taller than she had expected, taller than most of the alphas in the Blackwood compound, and he was completely still in the middle of all the movement around him. Everyone else was adjusting, performing, leaning slightly forward to show deference. He was the only person who seemed to require no adjustment at all. He stood as though the ground under him had been put there specifically for that purpose. Mira turned away. She carried her bucket to the back storage room, set it in the corner, and sat down on a low wooden stool with her hands in her lap. The storage room smelled of old wood and dried herbs and the particular kind of dust that accumulates in places where important things are kept but never used. There was a single narrow window near the ceiling that let in a pale stripe of light. Mira watched the dust move in that stripe of light, and thought about nothing in particular. She was not afraid of the Alpha King's arrival. She was not excited. She felt, as she usually did, a kind of steady patience that some people might have mistaken for calm. It was not calm. It was the particular state of mind that comes from learning that most things which happen in a day have nothing to do with you, and the ones that do tend to arrive whether you worry about them or not. What she was thinking about, if she was honest, was the greenhouse. 3 weeks ago she had planted a row of winter seeds along the back wall of the compound's old greenhouse, the one that no one used anymore because the glass panels were cracked and the heating pipes had broken years back. She had not told anyone she was using it. She had simply begun going there in the early mornings, before the compound woke up, and doing what she always did, pressing seeds into cold soil and watching them grow with a speed that should not have been possible. She had 11 seedlings now. They were small, green, almost embarrassingly alive for something planted in a cold room at the beginning of autumn. She thought about them the way other people thought about pets. The door to the storage room opened. A girl she recognized vaguely, one of the young pack members who ran messages between the households, stuck her head in. "They want all the Omegas in the East Hall," she said, setting up the welcome tables. Mira got up without a word. The East Hall was a long room with a high ceiling and old wooden beams that had been carved with the pack symbols of every alpha who had ever led Blackwood. Mira had spent a considerable amount of time in this room over the years, always at its edges, always with something in her hands. She was there now, carrying a heavy tray of clay cups from the kitchen, by the time the senior wolves began filtering in through the far doors. The room filled quickly. There was a particular kind of energy that accompanied formal pack gatherings, a self-conscious sharpening, like everyone remembering at the same moment that they were being observed. The she-wolves who outranked her had changed into better clothes. The ranked males stood straighter. Even the air in the room seemed to stiffen. Mira set cups on the table in the pattern she had been shown. 3 rows, handles turned to the right, spacing even. She did this without looking at the room. She did it the way she did most things, precisely, without decoration, and fast enough that she could leave before anyone thought to give her something else to do. She was halfway through the second row when she heard the voice. "The arrangement is incorrect." She paused. The voice came from her left, from one of the 2 tall women who had come in with the visiting party. They were both dressed in the dark colors of the king's territory, and they both had the particular air of people who assessed rooms for problems as a professional habit. Mira looked at the cups. Then she looked at the woman. "The cups should have 3 finger widths between each," the woman said, not looking at Mira, speaking to no one in particular, the way people do when they are correcting someone they do not feel they need to address directly. "They are too far apart." Mira measured 3 finger widths between the nearest 2 cups. The woman was wrong. The spacing was correct, or very close to it. She did not say this. She adjusted 2 cups slightly, reducing the gap by a small amount that would make no practical difference to anyone who drank from them, and moved on to the 3rd row. The woman watched her for a moment, then moved away. From the far end of the table, another voice, lower, belonging to one of the older Blackwood she-wolves named Priya, who was known for saying things that should probably stay thoughts, said something in a tone that carried further than she intended. "Why do they always put that one on the cups? She holds them like she has never seen a cup before." Quiet laughter from the person next to Priya. Mira finished the 3rd row. She stacked her empty tray under her arm and turned to go back to the kitchen. She was not angry. She had learned to notice the difference between the version of herself that absorbed things and the version that let things pass through. She was in the passing through version right now. She walked with her eyes ahead and her shoulders level. In the kitchen, the head cook, a wide-chested woman named Dora, was directing 3 people at once. She did not acknowledge Mira's return, which was normal. Mira set down the tray and picked up the next task from the bench, a basket of bread that needed to go to the side entrance for the visiting party's secondary staff. She was going out the side door when she heard Priya's voice again, coming through the open window of the East Hall. Priya and the woman she had been speaking to earlier had stepped close to the window, their voices carrying without meaning to. "She has been here since she was a child," Priya was saying, "and in all that time, not one ranked wolf has ever said a word to her directly. She is so thoroughly invisible that sometimes I forget she is a member of the pack at all." "Is she useful?" the other woman asked. "Useful enough," Priya said. "She does what she is told. She does not complain. She does not speak unless spoken to. If you had to describe her in one word, the word would be unremarkable. Actually, that is still one word too many." Both women laughed. Mira stood on the other side of the wall with her basket of bread. She had heard things like this before. Not exactly these words, but this kind of words, all her life. She waited until she was certain the laughter had finished, then she walked on. What Priya had said was not entirely wrong, which was the part that Mira knew she should think about carefully. She was unremarkable, on purpose, with great effort, because the alternative was being remarkable in ways she had no framework to explain. Invisible was a strategy. Invisible was survival. The distance between her and everyone else in the compound was not an accident. It was architecture. She delivered the bread. She went back to the kitchen. She took the next task, and then the next. By the time the welcome gathering was winding down, Mira had moved through the compound like water, filling every crack and corner where work needed doing, and not one person had spoken her name. She had been called "you" 3 times, the quiet one once, and pointed at twice. She had answered all of these without correction. The afternoon light was going when she finally had a break long enough to slip away to the greenhouse. It was cold inside, colder than outside in some ways because the broken glass panels let the wind whistle through in thin, sharp lines. But the seedlings were fine. They were more than fine. The one she had planted 7 days ago was already at her knee, its leaves wide and dark green and very deliberately alive. She crouched beside it and pressed 2 fingers into the soil at its base. The warmth was familiar, not heat exactly, but a kind of steadiness that moved from her fingers down into the roots. She had no better way to describe it. She had tried, in the private silence of her own thoughts, to find words for what she did when she touched living things and helped them grow, and all she had was the feeling itself, a current, very quiet, very deep, that moved through her like a second pulse. She stayed in the greenhouse until the light was nearly gone. When she stood to leave, she moved carefully between the rows of seedlings, the way you move through something you do not want to disturb. She was almost at the greenhouse door when she realized she was not alone. She had not heard anyone come in, she had not heard the door, but there was someone standing in the back corner of the greenhouse, near the cracked wall, very still, watching her. She turned slowly. He was tall. He was the same tall she had seen from across the courtyard, the same stillness that had caught her attention for half a second, before she made herself look away. The Alpha King stood in her greenhouse, in the near dark, looking at her seedlings. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the plants. He had not moved when she turned. He remained exactly where he was, his arms at his sides, his attention on the row of knee-high seedlings that should not, by any reasonable measure, have been that tall in autumn in a cold, broken greenhouse. He looked at them for another long moment. Then he looked at her. Neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the cracks in the glass and made the only sound there was. Mira's first instinct was to bow, to apologize, to say something that would reduce her presence in the room and give him an easy way to dismiss what he had just seen. She had this instinct the way she had all her instincts, as information to weigh, not automatically obey. She did not bow. She did not speak. She looked back at him with the same level attention that she gave every situation that might become a problem. He glanced once more at the seedlings. Then he turned and walked back through the greenhouse door without a word, ducking slightly under the cracked frame. The door clicked shut behind him. Mira stood in the dark for a long moment. Then she looked down at the seedlings. She touched one leaf, gently. She did not know what he had seen, exactly. She did not know what he would do with it. She only knew that for the first time in 14 years, someone in this compound had stood still long enough to look, really look, at something she had made. She did not let herself decide what that meant. Not yet. She walked back to the main building through the cold, and she went to bed early, and she lay in the dark with her eyes open for a long time, thinking about nothing she was willing to name. The next morning arrived the way mornings always did in the compound, with noise before light, the sound of the kitchen starting up, the low voices of the early shift workers moving through the corridors, the clatter of the heavy front doors being unbarred. Mira was already awake. She was usually already awake. She had a routine that she had built carefully over years, not because anyone required it of her, but because routine was the only kind of structure she fully owned. She was up before the kitchen staff. She washed her face in the cold water from the stone basin in the corner of the room she shared with 2 other Omega women who were both still sleeping. She dressed quickly. She braided her hair back, pinning it out of the way. She folded her blanket. Then she stood in the middle of the small room for exactly 30 seconds and did nothing at all. This was the part of her morning she was most private about. It was not meditation. It was not prayer. It was something closer to listening. A brief, deliberate silence in which she checked the steady current inside her, the way you might check a lamp before leaving it unattended, just to confirm it was where it was supposed to be. It was. It was always where it was supposed to be. She had never understood why, but she had stopped expecting to. She went to the kitchen and took whatever work was offered first. The compound was different that morning. She noticed it the way she noticed most things, not dramatically but with the particular attention of someone who had learned that changes in atmosphere usually signaled changes in behavior, and changes in behavior usually meant more work, a new problem, or both. The senior pack members were more awake than usual, moving with a visible awareness that the Alpha King was still here, that the visit was ongoing, that this was not an ordinary week. There were more formal meals to prepare, more rooms to maintain to a higher standard, more tasks done twice when once would have been enough, because everyone was performing competence for an audience. Mira worked steadily through the morning. She did not hurry, because hurrying made mistakes. She did not slow down, because slowing down invited criticism. She moved at a pace that was hers, and had always been hers, and she completed each task cleanly, and moved to the next. It was mid-morning when she first heard the name said out loud in full, Kale Dray, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, who had held his position for 9 years and was, by the account of everyone speaking about him in the hallways, not what anyone had expected a king to be. She heard this word used twice, unexpected, and both times by people who meant it as a compliment, though they seemed uncertain about it in the way people are uncertain about things they admire but cannot quite explain. What she had seen in the greenhouse she kept entirely to herself. The king's visit was supposed to last 5 days. By day 2, Mira could feel the tension in the compound like a change in air pressure before a storm. It was not the kind of tension that came from conflict. It was the kind that came from everyone performing their best version of themselves for too long in a row. The ranked wolves were exhausted by the effort of appearing relaxed, which is always more tiring than actually being relaxed. The senior staff moved in tight clusters, whispering in the way people whisper when they are deciding what to say before they say it. The kitchen ran longer hours. The cleaning schedules were revised twice. Mira had been assigned, without ceremony, to the section of the compound closest to the guest quarters. This was not an honor. The guest quarters were at the far end of the east wing, down a corridor that had 2 cold spots and a window that had never latched properly, and they required constant attention because the visiting party's staff were particular about the standard of upkeep. Mira had cleaned this corridor 4 times in 2 days. She was doing it again on the morning of day 3, when the door at the far end of the corridor opened, and Kale Dray walked out. He was not dressed formally. He was wearing the kind of plain, dark clothing that is chosen for function rather than impression, and he was alone. No beta, no guard, no one following him with a schedule or a problem. He paused in the doorway for a moment, looking at the corridor as though checking something. Then he looked at her. She was on her knees with a cloth in her hand, cleaning the baseboard. She had been doing this for 10 minutes. She straightened her back without standing up fully, which was the compromise her body had settled on for dealing with being caught at ground level during unexpected social situations. He walked toward her, not directly. He was going in the general direction of the corridor's far end, but his path would bring him within a few feet of where she was kneeling. She waited. He stopped. "You were in the greenhouse," he said. Not a question. She had known he would remember. She had known since she turned around in the near dark and found him standing there that this moment would arrive, and she had not been able to decide what she would do when it did. "Yes," she said. Straightforward. No additional words. He looked at her for a moment. Those plants should not be that size in this season. "No," she agreed. "They were planted recently. 7 days ago. The tallest ones," she looked at the cloth in her hand. "The smaller ones, 2 and 3 days ago." He was quiet for a moment, not an uncomfortable silence. He had a way of being quiet that did not demand to be filled, which was unusual in Mira's experience. Most people who outranked her were impatient with silence because they were accustomed to their presence prompting immediate response. He seemed, if anything, more comfortable in silence than in conversation. "How?" he asked. She considered lying. She considered deflection, which was her preferred alternative to lying because it was harder to disprove. She could say she used particular soil, particular water, a technique she had read about somewhere. Any of these would give him a satisfactory answer that went no further. Instead, she heard herself say, "I don't know. I never have." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite place. Not surprise. He had not looked surprised when he found her in the greenhouse either, which was itself surprising. Not disbelief. Something more like recognition, which made no sense because they had never spoken before yesterday. He said, "How long?" "As long as I can remember, since I was small. Does anyone else in the pack know?" "No." He nodded once. The way you nod when someone has answered a question you already half knew the answer to. Then he said, "What is your name?" "Mira." "Your full name?" She paused. "That is my full name." He understood immediately. She could see it. He understood that she had no family name because she had no family, that she had arrived here as a child with nothing that belonged to her, and had been given a single word to be called by, and that word was the whole of her official identity in the pack's records. His expression did not change, but something behind it shifted. "How long have you been in this compound?" he asked. 14 years. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "Thank you," which was so unexpected coming from an Alpha King to an Omega crouching on a corridor floor, that she did not respond to it for a full 3 seconds. By the time she thought of something to say, he had already moved on down the corridor. She stayed where she was. She looked at the cloth in her hand. Then she went back to cleaning the baseboard. She thought about the conversation for the rest of the morning in the careful, methodical way she thought about things that mattered. identifying each part of it, holding each part up against what she knew, setting it aside when it had no clear meaning. He had not threatened her. He had not made any indication of what he would do with the information she had given him. He had asked questions, a specific set of them, in a specific order, and then he had thanked her and left. The questions were what kept her attention, not because they were alarming, but because they were precise, in a way that suggested he had gone looking for something and found it. You did not ask how long and does anyone else know and what is your name, unless you were assembling a picture. You only assembled a picture if you already knew what it was supposed to show. She had no idea what picture he was building. She only knew she was in it. Lunch was bread and root vegetables, eaten standing at the back of the kitchen. Mira ate quickly and went back to work. She was assigned to the records room that afternoon, not to access anything, just to clean the shelves and dust the large ledgers that no one had touched in months. It was the kind of task assigned to Omegas precisely because it required no judgment, only patience. She liked the records room, though she had never told anyone this. It was quiet in there, and the shelves of old ledgers had a smell that reminded her of nothing she could name, but that she had always found calming. She moved through the shelves with her cloth, lifting each ledger carefully, wiping the shelf beneath it, replacing it in exactly the same position. She was near the back of the room when she came across the gap. It was a gap in the record of assigned designations, a section that covered the 30 years prior to her arrival, thick with entries for every rank, every family, every name assigned a position in the pack. She ran her cloth along the shelf and felt the space where 2 ledgers should have been, based on the numbering of the ones on either side. Someone had removed them. Mira stood with her cloth and looked at the empty shelf space. She did not know what the missing ledgers had contained. She did not know when they had been removed or who had removed them. She only noted the absence the way she noted all absences, as a fact, without rushing to give it meaning. She finished cleaning the shelf and moved on. That evening, while the compound's senior members gathered for the formal dinner that was the centerpiece of the king's visit, Mira was in the kitchen again, cleaning the preparation counters. The sounds of the dinner came through the walls in waves, low voices rising, the sound of cups being refilled, occasional laughter. She had no curiosity about what was being said in there. She had long since learned that the conversations held at formal dinners produced more ceremony than information. She was wringing out her cloth when Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway. "You are to go to the greenhouse and lock it," Nora said. "The head of grounds decided it is a safety issue with the broken glass. No one is to use it." Mira looked at her. "When?" "Now. Tonight. The lock is on the groundskeeper's hook." "All right," Mira said. She got the lock. She walked to the greenhouse in the dark, moving along the familiar path by memory. She pushed the door open and stood in the cold interior, listening to the wind in the cracked glass panels. She crouched down and touched the nearest seedling. It was fine. It was better than fine. It had grown another 2 inches today. She stayed for a few minutes. She did not know if she would be allowed back in. She did not know if the seedlings would survive if she wasn't. She pressed her fingers into the soil beside each one, briefly, in turn. And what she moved through her fingers into the earth was not something she could have explained to anyone, only that it felt like saying something important in a language that did not use words. Then she stood, and she locked the greenhouse door behind her, and she walked back through the dark. In the records room, an hour before, Cale Dre had stood alone in front of the same empty shelf that Mira had found. He had brought his own lamp. He had looked at the gap for a long time. He had not been surprised to find it. He had been surprised only by the precision of the removal. Not a single page left, not a single reference remaining. Whoever had taken those records had not done it carelessly. He had stood there long enough that the lamp began to flicker. Then he had gone back to the dinner, where he sat at the head of the table and ate and spoke and smiled at the right moments, and no one watching him would have guessed that he was working through a problem that had begun pulling at him the moment he stood in a broken-down greenhouse and watched an Omega woman grow plants in the dark with her bare hands. There were words for what she was. Old words, nearly gone. He had read them once in a text so old the pages had to be handled with gloves, and he had not thought about those words in years, because the things they described were supposed to be extinct. He looked at the alpha of Blackwood across the dinner table, a man named Oren, built like something that had never been asked to compromise, with eyes that assessed every room for advantage before he entered it. And Cale understood with great clarity that whatever Mira was, Oren would never see it. Oren saw rank. He saw yield and dominance and position. He saw the girl mopping floors and assigned her a value accordingly, and that value was 0. Cale Dre picked up his cup and drank from it and said nothing. He was very good at saying nothing when it mattered. Day 4 of the visit brought rain. Not the soft, agreeable kind that made rooftops look pretty. The cold, gray, determined kind that turned the compound's inner courtyard into a shallow lake and made every outdoor task twice as difficult. Mira was grateful for it in the private way she was grateful for most inconveniences. They gave her something concrete to solve, and solving concrete things was the part of her days she found most satisfying. She was redirected from outdoor corridor cleaning to the inner passages, working in the long covered walkway that connected the East Hall to the main residential building. 2 of the king's personal staff passed her 3 times during this work, and none of them looked at her. She was accustomed to this. She was so thoroughly accustomed to it that she had developed a kind of aesthetic appreciation for the skill involved in making deliberate non-eye contact. The slight elevation of the chin, the forward-pointed gaze, the small adjustment in step that said, "I have registered you and am choosing not to." She had decided over many years, genuinely invisible. Not in the way people said things like that to mean overlooked. In the almost literal sense that her presence did not register as information to the people around her. She could have stood in the center of the walkway and spoken in a normal voice, and the 2 staff members would have walked around her with the minimal adjustment of muscle memory and continued their conversation without pause. This used to bother her. It did not bother her anymore. What had replaced the bother was something more practical. The recognition that invisibility, properly managed, was a substantial advantage. She heard things invisible people should not hear. She moved through spaces invisible people should not be able to access. She understood the shape of the compound's internal dynamics better than anyone who outranked her, simply because she was never considered worth editing the conversation for. What she heard in the covered walkway on the 4th afternoon of the visit, from 2 of the Blackwood senior betas speaking just around the corner, was this. Oren wants the king gone before the end of the week. He was always going to be here 5 days. Oren wants it shortened. He sent a message to the king's beta this morning suggesting the weather makes the final day's activities impractical. What is he worried about? A pause. I don't know, but he's been in a foul mood since yesterday evening, since the records room. Mira kept moving her cloth in slow circles. She did not look around the corner. She did not stop. What happened in the records room? Nothing anyone is talking about directly, but Oren called in the head archivist this morning for a closed conversation, and the archivist came out looking like something very bad had been made clear to him. The voices moved away. Mira stayed where she was for a moment, then resumed cleaning. So, the gap in the records had been noticed, or rather, someone had noticed that someone else had noticed it. She considered this carefully as she worked. The removed ledgers covered roughly the period that included her arrival. She had never looked at the PAC's designation records directly. She had no reason to and no right to, as an Omega without family claim. But she had a general sense of what such records contained. Names, dates, family lineages, rank assignments. The designation given to each PAC member, and when, and on what basis. If her assignment had been in those ledgers, and it would have been, everything was, then someone had removed the record of how she had been classified and why. That meant either there was something unusual about her classification that someone did not want found, or there was something unusual about where she had come from that someone did not want traced, or both. She had spent 14 years assuming she was simply an orphan with no notable history. The possibility that her history had been actively concealed was new. She sat with it the way she sat with new things, without rushing, without panic, and noticed that it did not frighten her as much as it probably should. What it did do was make her curious. She was curious the way she was usually curious, quietly, with a patience that could wait as long as it needed to. She did not know enough yet to act on the information. She would wait until she did. That night, the rain intensified. The covered walkway flooded at the low end near the gate. Mira spent 2 hours after her official duties helping to redirect water away from the storage rooms, working alongside 2 young PAC members who were technically ranked above her, and spoke to each other the entire time without addressing her at all. She moved sandbags. She redirected a drainage channel with a temporary board that was her idea and that both of the ranked wolves accepted as their own plan without comment. By the time the worst of the flooding was managed, it was very late. The compound was quiet. She walked back toward the residential building through the wet dark, her clothes damp, her boots heavier than usual. She passed the main hall's side window and saw light inside. Just one lamp, burning at the long table. Cale Dre was sitting alone at the table with a book open in front of him and a cup of something that had probably gone cold. He looked up as she passed the window. She did not stop walking. But she looked back once, and he was still watching the window, and for one moment, brief, uncomplicated, and without meaning anything she was prepared to name, neither of them looked away first. She went to bed. She lay in the dark. She listened to her two roommates breathing and the rain against the roof, and the deep, familiar sound of the compound settling into the night. She thought, someone removed the record of how I was classified. She thought, he is looking for the same thing, in the same place. She thought, I do not know what I am. And then, which was new, she thought, maybe someone does. On the 5th morning of the king's visit, Mira found a folded piece of paper under her door. It was not addressed to her by name. It had no greeting. It contained one sentence in handwriting that was clear and unhurried, the kind that belonged to someone who wrote regularly. There are things in the old library building that would be useful to you. That was all, no signature. She read it twice, folded it back the way it had come, and put it inside the hem of her boot, which was where she kept the small number of things that were only hers. She thought about it all morning while she worked. The old library building was on the north side of the compound, past the grain stores, in a part of the property that had been used less and less over the years as the newer records room took over its function. It was not locked, she knew, because the lock had broken 2 winters ago and the repair had never been prioritized. The building was not forbidden, it was simply forgotten. She was good with forgotten places. She went that afternoon during the small gap between the midday work shift and the start of the evening preparations, when there was a 30-minute window in which no one was likely to notice where she was. She moved through the compound using the route along the inner wall, which was less trafficked in the afternoon, because the guards were doing their handover and weren't paying close attention to the people not carrying weapons. The old library building was smaller than she remembered it. She had not been inside in years. The door opened with a push, the hinges complaining about it, and she stepped into a room that smelled of old paper and cold air, and the particular staleness that accumulates when a building has been breathed in, but not out for a long time. The shelves were in disorder. Not deliberately. It was the disorder of low priority, of things placed temporarily and never returned to their proper position, of work stopped mid-task and not resumed. There were books here, yes, but also stacked ledgers, rolled maps, wooden crates, loose papers weighted down with other loose papers. Everything had the gray tinge of long neglect. She stood in the middle of the room and looked around and tried to understand what would be useful to her here. She started with the ledgers at the far left shelf, because that was where the oldest materials seemed to have migrated, the way old things always move toward the corners of places they are no longer needed. She ran her fingers along the spines, the ones that had any readable labels at all. Most of the labels were faded. Some were in a script she did not fully recognize, older than the standard written form the compound currently used. She found it on the 3rd shelf, not because she knew what she was looking for, but because when she pulled the ledger and opened it, the pages fell to a section that had been marked with a narrow strip of cloth. Recent, she could tell, because the cloth was a color that had not faded. Someone had been in here recently. Someone had marked a page for her to find. The text on the page was old but readable, printed in the careful, consistent hand of someone who had been making an official record. It was a classification document, the kind that established the formal taxonomy of pack ranks. She had seen these documents before in the records room, though never with this kind of detail. This one was from a period before the current system. She could tell from the date at the top of the page, which was more than 150 years old. She read slowly. The document described a ranking structure that was different from the current one. Not different in its broad shape. There were still alphas, still betas, still a hierarchy of power, but different in the way it accounted for a category that the current system did not include. The word used was Calith. She read the description 3 times, because the first 2 times she did not quite believe what she was reading. The Calith were described not as a rank but as a designation, a classification applied to wolves who manifested abilities outside the standard range. Not strength, which was the foundation of alpha power. Not speed or dominance or territorial instinct. The abilities listed in the document were different in kind, healing at an accelerated rate, accelerating the healing of others, stimulating growth in living things, stabilizing chaotic or wounded environments, amplifying the abilities of wolves around them. The document was careful to note that these abilities often presented as subtle and difficult to observe, which meant that Calith frequently went unidentified. The document described Calith as existing above rank, not alpha, not omega, not any position in the standard hierarchy, but something that predated the hierarchy. Something the hierarchy had been built around, according to the text, before the period of what was called the Great Consolidation. Mira sat very still on the cold floor with the ledger in her hands. After the Great Consolidation, the document continued. The Calith designation was removed from formal classification records. The section that followed explained the political reasons for this in dry, bureaucratic language that she had to read carefully to follow, but the meaning was clear enough. The current Alpha hierarchy had found the existence of Calith inconvenient, because Calith power was not the same as Alpha power, which meant it did not sit beneath Alpha power. It sat beside it, or above it, and neither position was acceptable in a system built entirely on the idea that strength of dominance was the only legitimate form of authority. So they had been erased, not physically. The document did not suggest violence, though it did not rule it out. Erased from the records, reclassified using the existing system, assigned the designation that would place them at the bottom of the hierarchy they were inconvenient to, classified as Omega, which in the current system meant the lowest rank, the least power, the minimum status. Filed there and forgotten. She closed the ledger carefully. She held it in her hands and stared at the floor. She was not shocked. She had no capacity left for shock. It had been worn out over many years of small shocks that she had absorbed without showing. But she felt something beneath the surface of her usual steadiness, something that had weight and heat that she could not immediately identify. She had asked herself her whole life why she was different, why the things she could do had no name in the world she lived in, why no one else seemed to notice them, and why she had learned from very early on that this was something to conceal. She had given herself the same answer that she had given everyone else by implication, that she was ordinary and unremarkable, just odd in ways that didn't matter, an Omega with nothing to distinguish her. That answer, she now understood, had been given to her by a system that had needed her to believe it. She sat there until she heard the bell that marked the start of the evening preparation shift, and then she stood, and she put the ledger back exactly where she had found it, and she replaced the cloth marker in its position. She let herself out of the old library building, and she walked back through the compound at her usual pace, and no one she passed looked at her differently than they had that morning. She was thinking about the conversation she'd had with Cale Dre in the corridor. How he had asked her specific questions, how he had not looked surprised by what she told him, how someone had left this paper under her door this morning, and how the cloth marking the page in this ledger had been placed there recently. He had known. He had known what she was, or had a strong idea of it, before she had found this ledger today. That was why his questions had been so precise. He had not been asking to find out if there was something unusual about her. He had been asking to confirm what kind of unusual it was. She walked to the kitchen and tied on her apron and began preparing for the evening meal, and while she worked, while she moved between the benches and the fire and the stacked plates, she felt the new information settle into her understanding of herself with the quiet finality of something falling into the exact place it had always belonged. She had always known she was not nothing. She had spent 14 years being told, in every language a pack uses to communicate status, that she was exactly nothing, less than nothing. She had lived in that designation, maintained it, protected it even, because it was safer than the alternative. But she had never believed it, not completely, not in the deepest part of herself where her actual assessment of things lived. She had held a small, wordless certainty there, the way you hold a match in cupped hands in the wind, sheltering it, not trusting the air around it, but keeping it burning anyway. The match had a name now. She held a pot with both hands and carried it to the fire and set it down, and when the warmth from the flames touched her face, she did not look away from it. She stayed for that warmth for a moment. Then she went back to work. The king's departure was scheduled for the following morning. She had understood from overheard conversation that Oren's attempt to shorten the visit had been quietly refused. Cale Dre had sent back a response through his beta that was polite and entirely immovable. He would leave on the agreed day, not before. She did not know what would happen tomorrow when he left. She did not know what he planned to do with what he knew, or whether he planned to do anything at all. She had no claim on his attention, and no reasonable expectation that the information he had gathered on this visit would translate into any change in her life. What she had was the information itself, what she was, what that meant in a history that had been rewritten to exclude it. She had always been invisible because invisibility was survival. But there was a difference she had never quite been able to articulate until now, between being invisible because you had chosen it, and being invisible because someone else had decided it was necessary. One was strategy. The other was erasure. She was not going to be erased anymore. She had not decided what she was going to do instead. She only knew, with the same absolute quiet certainty that had always been the truest thing about her, that something had shifted. The evening meal was served, the plates were cleared, the kitchen was cleaned. Mira did her part of all of this without drawing attention, without speaking more than was required, without giving any outward indication that anything was different about her. Nothing was different about her, on the outside. Inside, something very old had opened its eyes. The morning of the king's departure arrived with an unexpectedly clear sky, the rain having moved on in the night and left everything washed and still. Mira was up before anyone else again, and she went to the old library building before the compound stirred, because she had thought of something during the night. She went back to the third shelf. She found the ledger. She turned past the marked section and kept reading. The document continued for several more pages, and she read all of it this time. What she found in the later pages was something the earlier section had only implied. Caliph designation was not simply about individual ability. The document described the Caliph role in pack structure as connective. They did not lead the way alphas led, through dominance and decision. They stabilized. They amplified what was already there and corrected what was failing. The document used the word anchor in 3 separate places, which was not a word she had ever seen used in any other context in pack writing. An anchor was something that held, something that prevented drift, something that a structure depended on without always knowing it was depending on it. She read this section twice, very slowly, and then she sat on the cold floor for a long time. She thought about the years of cleaning and carrying and being invisible. She thought about the way injured animals found her and rested near her until they recovered. She thought about the greenhouse seedlings. She thought about the moment at the river, which had not happened yet, but which she did not know that. She only understood it, in this moment, as inevitable in the way some things are inevitable once you understand what you are. She also thought about 14 years of people looking through her. She thought about Priya's voice through the window, so thoroughly invisible that sometimes I forget she is a member of the pack at all. She thought about the files that had been removed from the records room so that whoever looked for her history would find a gap rather than a truth. She thought about how long that kind of erasure had to be practiced before it became something people no longer even knew they were doing, before it became simply the way things were, before the person being erased began, in small ways and over long years, to erase themselves, not because they believed they should, but because the cost of not doing so was too high. She had been that person. She recognized it now clearly, from the outside of it, the way you recognize a room's dimensions once you are standing in the doorway. She replaced the ledger. She walked out of the old library and back toward the compound's main buildings. In the courtyard, the king's party was preparing to depart. Horses and carts were being loaded, bags were being carried from the guest quarters. The Blackwood senior staff were assembling near the gate for the formal farewell, which had a specific order and a series of traditional gestures that would take approximately 15 minutes and mean very little. Mira went to the kitchen. She was given 3 tasks. She completed them. She was carrying a stack of cleaned linens to the storage room at the west end of the compound when she saw Cale Dre for what she believed would be the last time. He was walking across the courtyard toward the assembled farewell party, his beta 2 steps behind him, his bearing exactly what it had always been. Calm, contained, a quality of stillness that moved through crowds without disturbing them. He saw her from across the courtyard. He changed direction, not dramatically, just a slight angle adjustment that brought him across her path rather than away from it. His beta adjusted behind him with the smooth competence of someone who had done this many times. Mira stood where she was with her stack of linens. He stopped in front of her. He was carrying nothing. He looked at her with the same expression he had worn in the corridor, in the greenhouse, in every brief exchange between them. Attentive, specific, not performing anything. "I have sent a formal request to the Northern Archive," he said, in a voice low enough that the departure crowd 10 meters away could not hear it clearly. "They will confirm what I told you about the Caliph designation within the month. I am also leaving a sealed document with the compound's secondary archivist, not the head archivist, who reports to Oren, confirming that your designation file is under royal review. That makes any change to your status without written authorization from my office formally contested." Mira held her stack of linens and processed this. "Why?" she said. It was the only word that mattered. He did not look away. "Because someone should have done this 14 years ago," he said. "And failing that, today is the next best time." His beta made a small sound that might have been a cleared throat, a gentle signal that the farewell party was waiting. Cale Dre held her gaze for one more moment. Then he said, "Do not let them make you smaller than you are." He turned and walked toward the gate. Mira stood with her linens in the bright morning air and watched him go. She watched the formal farewell proceed with its 15 minutes and its traditional gestures. She watched the gate open and the party move through it. She watched the gate close. Then she walked to the storage room and put the linens away. And she stood alone in the small space for exactly 30 seconds. And she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Not in a way that unmade her, but in a way that settled something. He had not solved anything. He had not changed the compound or removed Oren's authority or reclassified her officially. He had done a careful, limited thing that created a small protected space around her designation, and then left her in it. It was not enough. She did not need it to be enough. What she needed, what she now had, for the first time in her life, was a direction, a true north, a shape to what she was that she could hold in her own hands and know was real. She had the word now, she had the history. She had the confirmation that what she could do had a name, and the name had a lineage, and the lineage had been deliberately severed to make room for a hierarchy that could not accommodate anything it hadn't created. She was not angry. She was not sad. She was something she did not have a precise word for, a kind of focused stillness that was also, underneath it, ready. Not for anything specific, just ready. She went back to work. She moved through the compound's afternoon tasks with the same quiet efficiency she had always brought to them. She was the same hands, the same face, the same woman who cleaned baseboards and carried linens and was called you by people who knew she had a name. But the inside of her had changed. The distance between what she had been performing and what she actually was had closed. Not loudly, not with any announcement, but completely. She was done being smaller than she was. She had just been told so by a king, and she had believed it not because a king had said it, but because she had always, in the deepest quiet part of herself, already known. The evening came. The compound settled. The absent visiting party left behind a different kind of quiet. Not tension, but the particular silence of a space that has stopped being performed in. Mira did her evening tasks. She washed her hands in cold water. She lay down in her narrow bed while her roommates breathed in the dark beside her. She lay with her eyes open and thought about the Caliph. She thought about seedlings growing through cold soil in a broken greenhouse. She thought about the gap in the records room shelves. She thought about 14 years of being invisible and the difference between choosing it and being made to live inside it. She was not finished. She did not know what was coming. She only knew that the story she had been living, the one where she was nothing, no family, no history, no name beyond a single word, had cracked open at its spine. Something true was in there. It had always been in there. It was hers, and it was old, and no one had managed to fully remove it no matter how many records they had taken from how many shelves. She closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she slept without listening for trouble. 3 weeks after the king left, Drek nearly bled out by the river, and Mira ran out of time to stay hidden. It began as an ordinary afternoon. The pack had organized a territorial patrol along the river boundary, a routine exercise that happened twice a month, meant to demonstrate presence at the edge of their land and discourage the loose groups of unaffiliated wolves that sometimes drifted through the region. Mira had no role in territorial patrols. She had no rank that would have placed her near one. She was in the northern supply stores that afternoon, cataloging firewood in preparation for winter, working alone because the task was considered too routine and too unglamorous for anyone with a rank above hers. The supply stores were at the northern edge of the compound, which was the closest point to the river. That was the only reason she was near enough to hear it when something went wrong. The sound was not dramatic. It was 3 short calls, the pack's signal for injury, not for danger, and then a silence that lasted too long. Mira set down her tally board. She stood still, listening. The signal came again, further from the gate this time, closer to the river. She went. She did not run immediately. She walked fast, moving through the supply yard and out the narrow northern gate at the back of the compound. She could hear voices now, urgent but not panicking. The controlled alarm of people who were handling something serious without enough help. She crossed the field at the back of the compound, moving through the long autumn grass, and came down the slope toward the river. She smelled the blood before she saw anyone. There were 4 of them at the river's edge, 3 ranked patrol wolves and Drek, who was the eldest son of Oren and carried his father's build and his father's certainty about the world, though somewhat less of his father's caution. Drek was on the ground. One of the patrol wolves, a young beta named Gil, was pressing both hands against Drek's side and not managing to look calm about it. The other 2 wolves were looking toward the far bank. Mira followed their gaze. There was nothing there now. Whatever had crossed the boundary was gone. But the evidence of what had happened was clear. The churned bank, the broken reed line, the blood on the stones that was not all Drek's. Mira came down the rest of the slope. Gil looked up at her with something between relief and confusion. Relief because another person had arrived, confusion because the person was her. "The injury is deep," Gil said. He was 19 and trying very hard to be calm about the fact that a very important person was bleeding significantly in his hands. "We sent Marcus back to the compound for the healer, but he will take at least 15 minutes. Mira crouched beside Drek and looked at the wound. She did not need to examine it at length to understand it. She had a quick and accurate sense of injuries the same way she had a quick and accurate sense of plant health. And what she understood about this one was that 15 minutes was too long. Not dramatically, not certainly, but very possibly. She sat back on her heels and looked at her own hands. She pressed her lips together. Drek opened his eyes. They had been closed when she arrived, and looked at her with the bleary, unfocused attention of someone who has lost enough blood that things are starting to blur. He looked at her the way he always had looked at her when he bothered to look at all. Without recognition, without interest. She was part of the compound's background. Furniture. "Who is that?" he said, to Gil rather than to her. "Mira," Gil said, "from the supply stores." Drek's eyes drifted closed again. He did not respond to the name. She had not expected him to. She looked at Gil. "You need to hold that pressure," she said. "Exactly where you have it. Do not move." She put her hands over Gil's. She did not push him aside. She worked alongside his grip, sliding her fingers down until they were between his and the wound, and then she pressed. What happened next was not something she had ever done in front of another person. She had healed herself before. Dozens of times, small injuries that should have left marks and didn't. She had healed animals that came to her, a dog with a broken leg that straightened in a week, a bird with a damaged wing that flew in 4 days. She had run the current through soil and water and her own skin. But she had never directed it outward into another person, had never been sure it would work the same way, had never been willing to find out in front of witnesses. She pressed her hands against the wound and she focused. The current was there. It was always there, that second pulse beneath her regular heartbeat, steady as anything she owned. She drew it forward. Not a dramatic surge, nothing that looked like anything from the outside except a woman pressing her hands against an injury. And she directed it into the wound the same way she directed it into soil when she wanted something to grow. With intention rather than force, with the sense of steering rather than pushing. The bleeding slowed. She could feel it before she saw it in the way the pressure in her hands changed. It slowed, and then it stopped. The tissue beneath her hands changed. She could feel this too, in the same wordless way she felt the state of any living thing she touched. It did not reverse, it did not undo, but the crisis, the immediate, dangerous, bleeding out crisis, resolved, in under a minute. Gil's hands, still pressed against her hands, went very still. The 2 other patrol wolves had turned from watching the far bank. They were watching her now. Drek's breathing changed. It steadied. His color was still wrong. He had lost blood that would take days to replace. But the desperate pallor of someone in a crisis had softened. He opened his eyes again and looked at the sky. Mira lifted her hands and sat back on her heels. Her hands were shaking, which was new. She had not shaken before. She did not know if that was because of the scale of what she had just done, or because she had done it in front of other people for the first time, and some part of her had been braced for a reaction she could not control. She looked at Gil. He was staring at her. "Do not tell anyone," she said. It was a reasonable request. She knew it was unreasonable to expect it to be honored. "How did you do that?" Gil said. Not a question, exactly. The voice someone uses when they have seen something their brain has not yet fully filed. "Do not tell anyone," she said again. She stood. She wiped her hands on her work apron. Her legs were steadier than she expected. She looked at the 2 patrol wolves who had been watching the far bank and were now watching her with the alert stillness of people whose world has just had its shape slightly altered. "He needs water and warmth and rest," she said. "When your healer arrives, let her assess him. He will tell her the bleeding slowed on its own." She began walking back up the slope toward the compound. "Mira," Gil's voice came from behind her. She stopped, did not turn. "It stopped bleeding in less than a minute," Gil said. His voice had steadied. He was a beta, and betas had training for managing things their instincts wanted to treat as emergencies. Wounds like that don't stop in a minute. "He is lucky," she said. She walked back to the supply stores. She sat down on the floor beside the firewood she had been cataloging. She put her face in her hands for a moment, not crying, just hiding, the way you hide in your own hands when you need somewhere quiet for a second. She had known, when she pressed her hands to the wound, that this was the end of a particular kind of safety. She had done it anyway. She would do it again. Drek was alive. The calculus was simple enough. What she had not fully anticipated in the moment was how fast information moved through a pack when the information was interesting enough. She found out how fast when she arrived at the kitchen for the evening shift, and found it significantly quieter than usual. The quiet that signals everyone has already heard something, and has not yet decided how to speak about it in front of the person it concerns. By the time she was laying the dinner table, the sound she was hearing through the walls and doorways of the compound was a hum, not language exactly. A change in register, the particular vibration of a pack whose picture of something has just been forcibly revised. Drek had told people. Of course he had. He had woken on the riverbank with his bleeding stopped, and looked at the Omega from the supply stores, and the first thing he had done, once Gil confirmed what had happened, was want witnesses who would confirm he hadn't imagined it. Mira set cups on the table in the pattern she had always used, 3 rows, handles right. She had done this 100 times. She finished the table and went back to the kitchen. What she felt was not fear. It was something closer to the feeling of standing in a doorway between a room you have been in for a very long time and one you cannot yet see clearly. Neither comfortable nor dangerous, just inevitable. She had known this door was there. She had been standing in front of it for years. She had just walked through it. Now the compound was going to have to decide what to do with what was on the other side, and she was going to have to decide the same thing, and neither side of that decision was going to be simple. She picked up a towel and went back to work. Later that night, she went to the greenhouse. She could not get in. The lock she had put there herself weeks ago was still in place, on Nora's instruction. She stood outside the glass panels and looked at the shapes of the seedlings through the cracked glass. They had kept growing. She could see that even from outside. They were nearly as tall as she was. She put her palm flat against the glass. "Still here," she said. She was not talking to the plants. She was talking to herself. She walked back to the residential building. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and counted her own heartbeats until she was calmer than she had been when she lay down. She counted the ways the next few days might go. She was methodical about it. She was not optimistic or pessimistic. She was practical. Some of those ways were manageable. Some were not. She held each one in her head long enough to decide how she would respond to it, and then she set it aside. Whatever came next, she had chosen it with her eyes open. That was the important thing. That was, she realized, the first time she had been able to say that about anything in her life in this compound. The choice had been hers. The cost would be hers. And the thing she had done, the life she had chosen over her own safety, was a life that would have been lost. She could live with that. She already was. The next morning, 3 things happened before Mira had been awake for an hour. The first was that Drek sent a message to the kitchen asking for her name in writing, not asking to speak to her, asking for her name in writing, as if confirming a fact he hadn't previously bothered to record. She found out about this from one of the kitchen workers who had handled the message, and she noted it with the same mild attention she noted most developments, as information, not yet as action. The second was that Oren held a closed meeting with his senior betas that lasted 45 minutes, and from which everyone emerged looking as though they had been given instructions they did not fully know what to do with. The third was that the healer, a compact, precise woman named Dr. Harwood, who had served the compound for 11 years and was not easily astonished, came to find her in the kitchen. "You were there at the river yesterday," Dr. Harwood said. She had her medical bag with her, which suggested she had come from Drek's room. "Yes," Mira said. "His wound closed. I examined it this morning. A wound that size, caused by what caused it, should have taken days to stabilize with proper treatment. It is nearly sealed." Mira held her dishcloth and waited. Dr. Harwood looked at her steadily. The doctor was one of the small number of people in the compound who had always made actual eye contact with her, not because she was particularly warm, but because she approached people the way she approached medical problems, directly, without sentiment. "I will need to write a report for Oren," Dr. Harwood said. "He will ask me what I think happened. I am going to tell him that Drek's constitution is unusually strong, and that the blood loss was, on reflection, less severe than initially presented." Mira said nothing. "That is not what I actually think," Dr. Harwood said. "But it is the report I am going to write." She held Mira's gaze for one more moment. "Be careful." She left. Mira stared at the sink for a moment, then went back to washing dishes. Be careful. It was the most useful and the most useless advice simultaneously. She was always careful. Careful was the entire architecture of her life. What she had not been, yesterday, was strategic. What she had been was honest. Honest in the sense of acting on what she actually valued, rather than what was safest. She did not regret it. She had understood when she pressed her hands against that wound that she was making a trade. Her concealment for someone else's life. She had made the trade willingly. What she had not calculated, and now had to adjust for, was that Drek had talked not once but repeatedly. By midday she was aware, from the texture of the compound's social air, that the story had reached at least 15 people directly, and the rumor of it had reached approximately everyone else. The specific content of the rumor varied. Some versions had her doing something dramatic and visible. Others were vaguer, describing only that something unusual had occurred and that Mira had been involved. A few versions attributed the rapid healing entirely to Drek's own constitution, which was the version Oren's household seemed to be advancing. What all the versions had in common was her name. She was no longer the quiet one, or that Omega from the supply stores. She was Mira. Named, specific, present. She noticed, that afternoon, that people looked at her when she walked past them, not the performance of deliberate non-attention she was used to. Actual attention. Some of it was wary, some of it was curious. A young pack woman she had never spoken to stopped walking to watch her cross the courtyard. Mira crossed the courtyard. She went where she was going. She did not look back. In the large meeting room off the main hall, Oren was having a second meeting by the afternoon. This one with only his two most senior betas, a man named Cole and a woman named Petra, who between them had advised Oren for 15 years and were collectively responsible for most of the decisions that had made the Blackwood Pack's internal structure as rigid as it currently was. She did not hear what was said in that meeting, but she saw Petra's face when she came out, and Petra's face was the face of someone who had just been asked to solve a problem that had no clean solution. That night, Gil came to find her. He found her in the covered walkway, which was where she often ended up in the evenings when the indoor rooms felt too close and the outdoor air was too cold. He was not one for ceremony. She had always appreciated this about him, in the way she appreciated things about people she had observed for years from a distance without ever exactly being near them. He sat down beside her on the walkway step. He was quiet for a moment in a way that was not uncomfortable. "I didn't say anything specific," he said, "about what I saw. I told the others on patrol not to either. But Drek talked, and once Drek talks it's—" He spread his hands in a gesture that finished the sentence adequately. "I know," she said. "Are you worried?" She thought about it honestly. "Not about what happened," she said, "about what happens next. Oren is going to want to understand it. He won't be able to understand it in a way that doesn't threaten him, which means he's going to reframe it as something else." She paused. "He's very good at that." Gil was quiet for a moment. "You sound like you've thought about this before." "I've had 14 years, she said. He nodded slowly. He was quiet again, and she understood that he was processing something, not about what she had done, but about the gap between what he had assumed about her and what the last 2 days had suggested. She gave him time to process it. She had no interest in filling his silence for him. "The things you can do," he said eventually, carefully. "How long have you known?" "Since I was small, before I came here." "Did you know where it came from?" "Not until recently." He sat with that. "Can you tell me?" She considered. He had not told anyone what he had seen, or had said as little as possible. He had come to find her. He was sitting beside her on a step in the cold as an equal, not performing rank. "The name for it is Caliph," she said. "It is an old designation. It was removed from the classification records during the Great Consolidation. Wolves who would have carried this designation were reclassified as Omegas, so that the Alpha hierarchy didn't have to account for a form of ability that didn't fit inside it." Gil was very still. "The abilities are real," she said, "old and real, just inconvenient to the people who wrote the current rules. So you were never actually an Omega." "I was designated one. There's a difference." He turned this over for a while. Outside, the wind moved through the compound trees. The night was very cold and very clear. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm going to keep doing my work until I have a better answer than that." He nodded. He stood up, brushed off his trousers, and looked at her for a moment. "For what it's worth," he said, "Drek is walking this morning. He shouldn't be walking for at least a week." She said nothing, but she felt something. Small, careful, not yet anything she would call comfort, but adjacent to it. The particular feeling of being seen by someone who was not afraid of what they were looking at. Gil went inside. Mira sat on the step for another half-hour, in the cold, listening to the compound settle around her for the night. She was waiting. She had always been good at waiting. But for the first time, the thing she was waiting for was not the end of something difficult. It was the beginning of something she had no map for, and she had discovered, sitting in the cold and the quiet, that the beginning of unmapped things was not as frightening as she had always assumed it would be. It was possible, she thought, that she had simply been prepared for it her whole life without knowing it. She went inside. She went to bed. She did not count her heartbeats this time. She was already calm. The great hall had never felt smaller. Mira stood at the edge of it, her back near the wall, her hands at her sides. Around her, the space was full. The senior wolves of the Blackwood Pack were all present, arranged in the loose, hierarchical clusters that formed whenever Oren called a gathering. She had been summoned here the same way she was summoned to everything. Someone had appeared at the kitchen doorway and said, "You," with a directional gesture, and she had followed. She had known what kind of gathering this was before she walked through the door. She had known from the way the corridor outside had felt, charged, the air a half-degree tighter than normal, the way any enclosed space feels when people inside it have agreed in advance on what they are going to do. Oren stood at the head of the room. He was a large man, and he used his size the way all large men who are also powerful use it, not as decoration, but as statement. He was not looking at Mira yet. He was speaking to the gathered pack, moving through the preamble that would eventually arrive at the point. She listened. He spoke about the riverbank incident the way people speak about things they have decided were not what they appeared to be. He used the word disorder. He used the phrase disruption to established understanding. He spoke about the importance of clarity in a pack's internal structure, and what happens when clarity is undermined by unexplained events. He said this all in the steady, authoritative tone of someone who has practiced making the irrational sound like common sense. She noticed that he had not yet used her name. Around the room, faces were carefully arranged. She had spent enough time in this pack to read faces well. What she saw was not uniformity of opinion. Some faces, the oldest betas, Oren's most reliable inner circle, were in full agreement with everything being said, nodding in small increments, their expressions smoothed to the particular blankness of people who have decided the correct position before the argument began. Some faces, younger wolves, mid-ranked ones, those who had heard the specific account from Gil or from the patrol, were more conflicted, their expressions moving between the default deference they owed Oren and a discomfort that had no comfortable name. Priya, who had called her unremarkable through the window weeks ago, was in the second group. Her expression was not unkind. It was, if anything, slightly ashamed. The look of someone hearing a version of events that doesn't quite match what they know to be true, and not yet sure what to do about the distance between the two. Dr. Harwood, seated at the far end of the room, was looking at nothing in particular, with the focused neutrality of a person who has already written their report and is not responsible for what anyone does with it. Then Oren turned and looked at her. "The Omega," he said. There it was, not her name, even now. Every face in the room shifted toward her. She held the attention without flinching. She had been looked at with greater or lesser coldness her whole life in this compound, and she had learned that attention, in itself, was not dangerous. What mattered was what came with it. "There has been a story circulating," Oren said, "about the events at the river boundary. A story involving impossible claims about what this Omega did or did not do." He paused, surveying the room with the precision of someone checking whether his audience was following correctly. Claims that are irresponsible. Claims that create confusion. Claims that are, in the considered opinion of this household, the product of extreme stress and misperception on the part of those present. She watched him deliver this. She noted the precision of it. Not a direct attack, not an accusation, something more elegant. He was not saying she had lied. He was saying the witnesses had been confused. He was making the event itself the mistake rather than any individual, which was neater and harder to directly argue against. "There is a further concern," Oren said, and his voice took on a specific weight she recognized, the weight of a man about to say something he has rehearsed. An Omega who allows stories of this nature to circulate, without correction, without clarity, without stepping forward to provide a true account. Such an Omega is either complicit in the confusion, or is herself unstable in ways that affect her judgment. He paused. Mira understood what he had just done. He had given her two options, both of which resulted in the same outcome. Either she had encouraged the story, which made her dishonest and manipulative, or she was genuinely unaware of her own abilities, which made her mentally unstable. Either way, the conclusion was the same. She was a problem that required management. She kept her face still. She was very good at keeping her face still. Around the room, a quiet had settled in, not a comfortable quiet. The kind that comes when everyone is waiting to see whether what is about to happen will be as simple as expected. Petra, Oren's senior beta, stepped forward from her position near the left wall. "The question before this gathering," Petra said, "is one of pack order. An unexplained event occurred at our boundary. The account given by those present is inconsistent with established understanding of pack ability and rank. For clarity and for safety, we are proposing a formal review of the Omega's designation and status within this pack, to begin immediately." The review. She had known this was the direction. A formal review of her designation would take weeks, during which her status could be suspended. Suspended meaning she could be removed from the compound's residences, from the kitchen, from any role, pending the outcome. It was, in practice, expulsion in stages. She looked at Oren. He was looking back at her. There was a moment. One of those moments that she had learned, over years, to recognize and not rush, where a choice was available that would not be available much longer. She could be silent. She had been silent, effectively, her entire time in this compound. She could fold back into invisibility, accept the review, say nothing that would accelerate the outcome they had already decided on. The strategy had served her once. It had a kind of terrible familiarity. Or she could speak. She had spent 14 years with her voice behind her teeth. She had spent 14 years being careful with what she showed and what she withheld, and who she became in public versus who she actually was. She had spent 14 years watching this pack assume she was nothing, because she had, for very good reasons, allowed them to. The reasons were still good. The calculation had changed. She said, into the room's waiting quiet, "My name is Mira." It was not loud. It was not dramatic. She said it the way she said true things, directly, without decoration. The room shifted. Not visibly. No one moved, but in the way rooms shift when something enters them that didn't register before. "My name is Mira," she said again, "and I have worked in this compound for 14 years, and in that time I have not told anyone my name without being asked." She paused. "I am going to say some things now. I would ask that you let me finish them before responding." Oren's expression did not change, but she saw his hand move, very slightly, at his side. A small, involuntary tension. "What happened at the river was not a misperception," she said. Drek Oren was losing blood from a wound that would have put him in serious danger within the time it took for a healer to arrive. "I stopped the bleeding. I did this with my hands. It took less than a minute. 3 other pack members saw it. All 3 have given consistent accounts, because consistent accounts are what happens when multiple people observe the same factual event." She let that sit for a moment. "I have been able to do things like this my whole life," she said. "Healing, growth. I can help living things recover faster than they would on their own. I have hidden this because I learned early that the pack did not have a framework for it. I have spent 14 years as an Omega, because that is the designation I was given when I arrived here as a child, and I was a child, and I had no way to argue with it." The room was very still. Even Oren was still. "I have since learned," she said, "that the reason the pack has no framework for what I can do is that the framework was deliberately removed from classification records more than 100 years ago. The abilities I carry belong to a designation called Calith. That designation was erased during the Great Consolidation because it described a form of ability that did not fit neatly below Alpha Authority. Wolves who would have been correctly classified as Calith were reclassified as Omegas." She looked at Oren steadily. "I was not the first." Silence. She could feel the room. She had always been able to feel rooms, the temperature of a collective state of mind, the way you feel weather. What she felt right now was complicated. Discomfort in the older wolves, the ones most invested in the current order. Shock in some of the younger ones. In Priya, something that looked like it might be relief, which was the most unexpected thing of all. In Dr. Harwood, the expression of someone who had suspected this and is noting that they were right. Oren found his voice. "What you have just described," he said, "is an unsupported historical claim being used to—" "There is a ledger in the old library building," Mira said, "on the 3rd shelf from the left. The relevant section is marked with a strip of cloth. You are welcome to read it. The information it contains is from 150 years ago and has not been altered because the ledger was in a building no one had used in years." She paused. "The relevant ledgers from the active records room were removed recently. You may know more about that than I do." Something very cold crossed Oren's face. She had said enough. She knew she had said enough because the room had reached the particular kind of silence that signals maximum information load, the point past which adding more words would reduce rather than increase their impact. She had given them facts. She had named her name. She had put the frame of the argument where she wanted it. She did not bow. She looked at Oren for a moment, and then she looked at the gathered pack and she said, "I am not asking you to believe me immediately. I am asking you to look at the evidence before you decide what I am." Then she stood and waited. The waiting was comfortable, in the particular way that things become comfortable when you have stopped fighting against their necessity. She was here. She had said what was true. The room would do what the room would do. Around her, people were looking at each other now, which was a significant change from looking at her. Conversation was beginning. Not in the open, not yet, but in the small movements and eye contacts, and half-turned shoulders of people who are revising what they thought they were about to agree to. Priya said, from the middle of the room, in a voice just loud enough to carry, "Can we see the ledger?" Oren turned his head toward her, with the slow deliberateness of someone controlling an impulse. Priya held his look without flinching, which told Mira more about Priya than everything she had observed before. Oren said, "This gathering is not a debate." "No," Priya said, "but it should be." And that was where the room fractured, not dramatically, not with any raised voices or visible confrontation. It fractured in the way things fracture when they have been under pressure for long enough, with a crack that runs through the middle, quiet and irreversible, that everyone feels before anyone acknowledges it. Mira stood at the edge of the room and watched it happen. She did not feel victorious. She did not feel safe. She felt the particular, precise feeling of someone who has taken a step on a path they cannot back off of, and has looked down, and found solid ground. The ground was not wide, it was not comfortable, but it was hers. She kept standing on it. The gathering did not end cleanly. Gatherings rarely did when they had been expected to produce one outcome, and arrived at a different one. Oren called a close to the formal portion of the meeting within 10 minutes of Priya's challenge, which was faster than Mira had expected. She understood the calculation. A gathering that is not going the way you planned is better dissolved than debated. She walked out of the great hall with the rest of them, and went directly back to the kitchen, where the evening meal was in an early stage, and no one had done the work that was usually hers. She tied on her apron. She began where she had left off. The kitchen workers who were there when she returned did something she had not experienced before. They moved aside to give her space, and not in the deferential way people move aside for someone ranked above them, in the careful way people move when they are not sure of the geometry of a new situation. She did not comment on this, she simply worked. What came in the hours after the gathering was a different kind of tension from anything she had lived with before. The compound's social temperature had not cooled after the fractured meeting. It had climbed, unevenly, in different rooms and clusters, and she could feel it the way she felt everything about the living world around her. As information, as pressure, as a kind of signal that something was changing, and hadn't finished changing yet. 3 people came to find her over the course of the evening. None of them were ranked wolves she knew well. They were, all 3, mid-ranked members of the pack who had been in the great hall, who had heard her, who had watched Priya hold Oren's gaze, and who came individually, at different times, with the same slightly tentative energy. The first was a man in his mid-30s named Owen, a Delta who coordinated the compound's building maintenance. He stood at the kitchen doorway while she was washing pots and said, "Can you show me where the ledger is?" She told him the shelf. She told him the ledger's position. She said the section was marked with a strip of cloth. He nodded and left. The second was a young she-wolf she knew by face but not by name, who said, in a very low voice, "I heard you in the hall. I just wanted you to know I heard you." She left before Mira could respond. The third was Priya. Priya came to the kitchen near the end of the evening shift, when most of the work was done and only Mira was still there, finishing the last of the cleaning. Priya was dressed casually, which meant she had not come in any official capacity. She sat down on one of the kitchen stools with the particular quality of someone who has decided to stay. "You were very calm in there," Priya said. "I was prepared," Mira said. Priya was quiet for a moment. She looked at her own hands on the countertop. "The thing I said," she said, "about you, a few weeks ago, through the window, about you being unremarkable." Mira continued cleaning. "I was heard by more people than I knew," Priya said, "including probably you." "Yes," Mira said. Another silence. Priya had the kind of face that could not hide what it was thinking, which was both her greatest weakness in this pack and, Mira suspected, the thing that made her fundamentally trustworthy. "I am sorry," Priya said, "for what I said." Mira stopped cleaning. She looked at Priya. She thought about the dozens of things that had been said about her and around her, and over her head in 14 years. By Priya, yes, but also by everyone else in every room she had been invisible inside. "I appreciate that," she said, and she meant it. Not warmly, not in a way that erased the weight of what had been said, but honestly. Priya nodded. She stood. She looked at Mira with an expression that was mostly just the attempt to look clearly. "You're going to need people who will say what they saw," Priya said. "When Oren starts the formal review, he's going to start it, whatever he said in there. He's going to keep going, just differently." "I know," Mira said. "I will say what I saw in the hall," Priya said. "I did not see the river, but I saw the hall." She left. Mira stood in the kitchen for a moment after the door closed. Then she finished the last of the cleaning and put out the kitchen lamp and went to bed. She lay in the dark with her hands on her chest and thought about the day, not systematically, the way she usually thought through difficult things, just letting the day pass through her in chronological order, the way water moves. The gathering, her own voice in the gathering, which had surprised her even as she used it, Oren's face, Priya's face, Owen coming to find her, the young she-wolf who just wanted her to know she had been heard. She thought, something has started. She had known something was starting since the greenhouse, since the corridor conversation, since the ledger in the old library. But those had been private knowings, internal reckonings, the kind of change that happens inside a person and does not yet have a shape in the world outside. This was different. This had a shape now. It was in the room. It was in the pack's air. It was in the crack that had run through the gathering when Priya challenged Oren. She did not know what it would become. She was not naive about the distance between a crack and a collapse. Cracks could be filled, could be managed, could be smoothed over by people with the time and authority to smooth things. Oren had both. But she also knew, and this was the thing she kept coming back to, the thing that had surprised her most about the day, that she had spoken her own name in a room full of people who had spent years calling her you, and the room had changed. Not completely, not enough, but changed. She closed her eyes. She thought about the Caliph designation, about the word anchor, about the compound's greenhouse seedlings growing in the dark, in the cold, in conditions that should not have sustained them, about how living things found ways to grow in whatever space was available to them, about how, sometimes, the growing broke the container. She did not know if she was strong enough for what was coming. She did not know if strength, in the conventional sense, was the relevant quality. What she knew was what she had always known, the single thing she had carried since she was a child, with no name and no family, and a stranger's designation stamped on her file, that she was real, that what was inside her was real, that the current moving through her when she pressed her hands to wounded things and helped them heal was not a trick, not an error, not a misperception. It was hers. It had always been hers. And now, for the first time, in front of witnesses, in a room full of people who outranked her in a system that had been built specifically to keep her from having anything, she had said so. She had said, "My name is Mira." It was 3 words. They were not enough words to change everything. But they were, she understood, as sleep began to pull at the edges of her attention. The 3 right words. The ones that had needed saying. The ones she had kept behind her teeth for 14 years like something precious that might be broken if it met the wrong air. She had said them, and nothing had broken. She slept. A month after the king left, a sealed letter arrived at the compound from the Northern Archive. It was addressed to the secondary archivist, a quiet man named Den, who was 43 years old, had worked in the records room for 16 years, and was one of approximately 4 people in the compound that Mira trusted in any meaningful sense. Den did not open it immediately. He brought it to her first. He found her in the courtyard at midday, carrying a basket of winter root vegetables from the storage shed to the kitchen. He approached from the side, which was how considerate people approached someone carrying heavy things, and he held up the letter without speaking. She put her basket down. She looked at the letter. The seal on it was official, the kind that carries weight precisely because it is harder to ignore than a verbal message. She read the outside of it. Northern Archive, Registry of Historical Designations. "It came this morning," Den said, "with the regular courier." She nodded. "Open it." He broke the seal. He read it himself first, which she appreciated. He was the kind of person who checked a thing before presenting it, to avoid surprises. His face, while reading, moved through 3 expressions: careful attention, then recognition, then a controlled stillness. He handed her the letter. She read it standing in the courtyard with the winter light flat and cold around her. The Northern Archive's letter was formal and precise. It confirmed, in the careful language of official documentation, that the designation Caliph had existed in the pre-consolidation classification system. It confirmed that wolves carrying this designation had been systematically reclassified during the Great Consolidation period, primarily to the Omega designation. It confirmed that the Caliph designation carried specific ability markers that differed from all other rank designations. And it confirmed, and this was the part she read twice, that under current royal charter, any wolf for whom reasonable evidence of Caliph ability existed was entitled to formal reassessment outside the standard pack ranking system, with results to be processed by the king's own office rather than individual pack authority. At the bottom of the page, below the archive stamp, there was a handwritten note. The handwriting was the same handwriting that had been on the note slipped under her door, clear, unhurried. The note said, "The process will take time, so will the opposition. What I said at the gate still stands." She folded the letter. She looked at Den. "You need to record receipt of this in the compound log," she said. "Today, with the time." Den looked at her. "Oren will read the log." "I know," she said. "Record it anyway." He took the letter and did exactly what she asked. She picked up her basket of vegetables and walked to the kitchen. The letter's arrival changed the compound's atmosphere in a way that she had not fully predicted. She had expected Oren's opposition to intensify, that she had predicted correctly. What she had not anticipated was the degree to which the letter's existence, even before its contents were widely known, would fracture the authority of his opposition. He could not simply remove the letter. Den had logged it. The logging could not be unlogged without someone noticing. A Royal Archive document, officially received and officially recorded, was not the same as an Omega's personal account of her own abilities, and everyone in the compound with any understanding of how formal pack governance worked understood this. What Oren could do, and did, was move to control the interpretation. He called another meeting within 24 hours of the letter's arrival. This one was smaller, only the inner circle, only the people whose position depended most directly on the current structure. Mira was not summoned. She knew about it from the gap it left in the compound's rhythm, the way key people disappeared from their usual places for 2 hours in the late morning. She was in the covered walkway when they came out. Cole and Petra walked past without looking at her, their conversation quiet and technical. She caught enough to understand that they were discussing the language of a formal response, the kind of administrative pushback that could buy time without technically breaking with the Royal Charter's authority. Oren came out last. He paused when he saw her. She had not moved. She was at the end of the walkway with a cloth in her hand, and she met his gaze with the same level attention she had been meeting everyone's gaze with for the past month. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression she had not seen before, not anger, which she had expected, but something more like assessment, as if he were looking at her and trying to reconcile the image he had maintained of her with the thing that had been complicated by an archive letter and a fractured meeting, and a beta named Priya who was still willing to say what she had seen. He did not speak. He walked away. She cleaned the baseboard she had been cleaning, then she went back to work. The first real shift happened not in the leadership, but in the compound's middle. The betas and deltas and ranked wolves who were not invested in the hierarchy in the abstract, but lived it concretely, day by day. She noticed it first in the kitchen, where she had spent 14 years being ignored, and where she suddenly was not being ignored, not reverently, not with any performance of changed attitude, just noticed. Eyes that stayed on her for a second longer than they used to. Conversations that did not quite stop when she entered a room the way they had always stopped before. Owen, the building maintenance delta, found her one afternoon and told her he had read the ledger. He said this simply, without apparent agenda, as though he was logging a fact. She thanked him and he went back to what he had been doing. The young she-wolf who had come to the kitchen, her name was Clara, she learned, started sitting at the end of Mira's section of the meal bench, not next to her. At the end of it, which in the compound's spatial language meant, I am associating myself with this space. These were small things. She did not let them make her careless. Because what was also happening, at the same time, in the other direction, was the careful tightening of Oren's position. He did not move against her directly. He was too experienced for that, and too aware of the archive letter's weight. Instead, he worked at the edges. Tasks she had always done were quietly reassigned. Access to certain parts of the compound was gently, informally restricted. Not through any official order, but through the particular management of space that happens when someone with authority arranges for you to be inconvenient to yourself. The greenhouse was locked, still, from weeks ago. Now 2 of the supply rooms she had used regularly were also locked. The key to the northern storage shed, which she had always held, was returned to the groundskeeper without explanation. She noted each of these. She made no protest. She had understood from the beginning that the contest she was in was not going to be fast. She had understood it was not going to be dramatic in the way that contests and stories are dramatic, a single confrontation, a clear outcome, a door either opening or closing. Real contests, in her experience, were accumulations. They were made up of small moments, each one individually manageable, each one adding weight to a structure that would eventually tip. She was building weight on one side, Oren was building it on the other. The question of which side would tip was not yet resolved, and she did not allow herself to believe it was. What she did allow herself was a daily check-in with her own resources, not in the mystical sense but in the practical one. What did she know? What had changed? What were her dependencies, the people, the spaces, the information, that she could not afford to lose? She kept this inventory in her head the way she had always kept everything important, without writing it down, without trusting it to any medium that could be removed from a shelf. Den was the most important. Den had logged the letter. Den had access to the secondary records that Oren did not control directly. Den was not a rebel. He was a careful man who believed in the accuracy of records and found falsification genuinely offensive as a professional matter. She had not asked him to be her ally. She had simply been accurate with him, and he had responded to accuracy the way he always responded to it. Gil was the second. Gil had seen what he had seen, and he had not unbecome that witness simply because it was inconvenient to be one. Priya was the third, which was the one she had not expected. Priya, who had called her unremarkable through a window, who had come to the kitchen and sat on a stool and apologized with the uncomplicated directness of someone who had recognized something and decided to deal with it. Priya, who had, in the great hall, said 4 words, "Can we see the ledger?" that had shifted the room more than Mira's own speech. She was not alone. She had been alone her whole life, and she was not, and the strangeness of this was something she returned to daily, without quite being able to take its measure. A letter arrived from the king's office, different from the archive letter. This one came directly to her, addressed by her name, delivered by the same regular courier. It was brief, 2 paragraphs, covering the current status of her formal reassessment request and outlining the next steps in the process. It was administrative and correct and gave nothing away about anything personal. But at the end, below the official close, there was again a single handwritten line. "How are the seedlings?" She read it twice. Then she put it in the hem of her boot next to the first note. She went to the locked greenhouse door. She stood outside it in the cold and put her palm flat against the glass. She could feel them on the other side. She always could. They were still alive. They were, if anything, stronger than when she had last touched them. Whatever she had left in the soil when she said goodbye to them had sustained something. They were growing in the dark and the cold without her. She stood outside the locked door and understood, with the kind of understanding that arrives quietly and then is obvious, that she was too. The winter deepened. The compound contracted in the way compounds do when the cold becomes the primary fact of every day. Everyone moving closer to the heat sources, the outdoor work compressed into necessary hours, the long evenings in shared spaces creating the kind of proximity that either builds trust or sharpens resentment, depending on what was already there. What was already there, in the Blackwood compound, was a fracture that Oren had not managed to close after the Great Hall meeting. He had tried. He had worked at the edges of it with the patient, experienced manipulation of someone who had held his position for 20 years by understanding exactly which levers to pull. He had increased the workload of the wolves most likely to support Mira's account, occupying their attention. He had applied quiet social pressure to the mid-ranked wolves who had shown curiosity or openness. He had made Priya's life considerably less convenient in a series of small ways that could not be individually identified as retaliation. None of it had fully worked. That was the thing he had not planned for. The compound had seen something, through multiple witnesses, that was difficult to explain away. Wounds that healed that fast did not simply happen. Seedlings that grew that tall in conditions that prohibited it did not simply grow. The archive letter had confirmed that there was a historical category for what people had seen, and while Oren could argue about interpretation all he liked, he could not make the archive letter stop existing. Mira moved through all of this with the same patience she had always brought to things she could not resolve quickly. She did her work. She spoke when she had something true to say. She did not perform either confidence or fear, because she had been performing nothing for a month now and she was not going to start. She was in the library building, the old one, because Den had given her unofficial access to it through the secondary record schedule, which Oren did not review directly, when she found the second ledger. She had been looking, not frantically, not with any specific expectation, but with the methodical thoroughness that she brought to any space where important things might have been set aside and forgotten. She had been through the shelves twice already. The second time, she went row by row from the bottom, including the low shelves that required crouching, the ones that were the least ergonomic to examine, and therefore the least examined. The second ledger was tucked behind a large water-damaged map case on the lowest shelf of the back wall. It was not marked. It was not distinctive. It was positioned in the way that things are positioned when someone wants them not found but also cannot bring themselves to destroy them entirely. She brought it to the central table and opened it. What she found was not another classification document. It was a set of meeting records, handwritten minutes of Pack Council gatherings from the period just before the Great Consolidation, when the decision to remove the Caliph designation from the formal system was being debated. She read for a long time. The minutes were dense and bureaucratic and full of the careful language that people use in official records when they are doing things they expect to be judged for. What she was reading, underneath the language, was the record of a decision made in full knowledge of its injustice. Not by people who believed Caliph wolves were worthless, by people who believed the opposite, who recognized the ability, who understood the history, who knew exactly what they were erasing, and who erased it anyway, because the alternative was a restructuring of the hierarchy that would have cost them their positions. She sat with this for a long time. She had expected, when she found the truth of her history, to feel something sharp and hot, something that would confirm the anger she had been carrying quietly for 14 years as fully justified and finally addressed. She had expected the truth to feel like a verdict. Instead, what she felt was more complicated and quieter and ultimately more useful. She felt grief, which was new, not for herself exactly, but for all the people whose designation had been removed before hers, who had lived their whole lives as the wrong thing and never found the ledger that told them otherwise. She felt something like fury at the specific people who had sat in those meetings and made those choices with full understanding of what they were doing. And she felt, underneath both of these, the solid and specific clarity that comes from knowing the full shape of something you have only ever known the surface of. She photographed the pages in her memory. She could do this. She had always been able to. A combination of the intense attention she paid to written things and some quality of her recall that was sharper than it should have been. She put the ledger back where she had found it. She left the building and walked back through the cold. She went to find Den. Den listened to her account of the second ledger, with the contained attention of a professional receiving important information. He asked 2 clarifying questions about its physical location and condition. Then he said, "I want to see it myself." "I know," she said. "I want you to." They went that afternoon. Den read the relevant sections slowly, turning pages carefully, making small sounds that were not words. When he was finished, he sat with the ledger in his hands for a moment. "There are people named in these minutes," he said. "Yes. The family lines of some of those people are still represented in this pack." "Yes." He looked at her. "This changes the genealogy of how the current leadership structure was justified." "Yes," she said, "that is the point." Den replaced the ledger with the same care he gave to everything in the archive. He stood for a moment in the quiet of the old building, then he said, "This needs to go to the king's office." "I know," she said. "I'm going to send it." Den looked at her with something she recognized in him for the first time, not just the professional precision she had always seen, but something that was almost admiration, though he was too reserved to make it visible. "How?" he asked. "The same courier that has been carrying letters from the king's office," she said. "Den, has a correspondence this month been exclusively channeled through one route?" He understood. "The head courier reports to Oren's Beta. But the secondary courier, the one who comes on the 15th of the month, reports to the territory's regional office, not to individual pack leadership." Den was quiet for a moment. "He comes in 2 weeks." "I know." She spent the next 2 weeks writing. Not the ledger. She could not send the physical document without it being missed, but a detailed account of what it contained, page by page, section by section, as precisely as her memory could reproduce it. She did this in the evenings, in the covered walkway when it was empty, with a lantern and the particular focused stillness that she brought to important things. She was not worried about Oren finding the account before she could send it. She hid nothing, physically. She kept the pages in her boot. She also, during these 2 weeks, received visitors, people who had not spoken to her in 14 years, or who had spoken to her only to direct her toward a task, came to find her, not in groups. Individually, with the slightly uncertain energy of people who are revising a long-held position and are not sure yet of the social protocols on the other side of it. She spoke with most of them, not warmly, not with any performance of forgiveness. Directly. She answered the questions that were genuine. She acknowledged the accounts of the river that were accurate. She said very little about Oren and nothing about the meeting records. What she was building, through these conversations, was not alliances in the political sense. She had no interest in faction building or in the kind of social maneuvering that pack politics usually required. What she was building was something more fundamental, the accurate version of her own history, spoken by her own mouth, into as many ears as were willing to receive it. The truth, as she had learned both from the ledgers and from her own experience, had a hard time surviving in the absence of witnesses. Oren had removed the ledgers because records without readers are just silence. She was becoming her own record. She was making sure she had readers. The 15th arrived. The secondary courier came at midday. She gave him her account in a sealed envelope, addressed through the regional office to the Northern Archive, with a note indicating it was to be passed directly to the king's private secretary. She watched the courier ride out through the compound gate. Then she went back to the kitchen. That evening, at the dinner table, she sat in her usual place at the end of the bench. Clara was at the end of her section, as she had been every evening for weeks. Owen was across the table, talking to someone else. Priya was further down. And Drek was there, at the top of the table, in his usual position beside his father. She had not spoken directly to Drek since the river. He had recovered fully, which she knew from the way he moved. Easy, unrestricted. the confidence of a body that has forgotten it was ever in crisis. He looked at her once, during the meal, not the looking through that had always been his default, the other kind. She met his look. He looked away first. She ate her dinner. She thought about the letter in the courier's bag, moving through the cold toward the regional office. She thought about the archive, and the council minutes, and the generations of people who had not known the shape of what they were. She thought, I am making it harder to erase. Not impossible. She was not under any illusion about the forces arranged against the uncomfortable truth she was sitting in the middle of. Oren was experienced and patient and controlled significant resources. The formal reassessment process would take months. The opposition that would build against any reclassification of a Caliph in an active pack would be substantial. But she had been patient her whole life. She had built in the dark and in the cold and without acknowledgement. She was very good at persisting through conditions that should not sustain growth. She finished her dinner. She cleared her plate. She said goodnight to Clara, which was the first time she had said goodnight to anyone in this compound who was not one of her two sleeping roommates. And Clara looked up and said goodnight back, with the uncomplicated warmth of someone who had been waiting for the permission. Mira walked to her room. She stood in the dark for 30 seconds, listening to the current inside her. The second pulse. The thing that had always been there and had a name now. It was steady. She went to sleep. The message arrived on a Tuesday. Not from the king's office, not through the courier system, not in a sealed letter with an official stamp. A member of Kale Dre's personal staff appeared at the compound gate in the early afternoon, alone, on a fast horse. She presented her credentials to the gate guards and asked to speak with the secondary archivist. Den came to find Mira in the supply stores, where she had been since morning. He looked composed, which for Den was different from looking calm. Composed was the face he wore when something was large, and he had decided to handle it without showing that. He wants to speak with you, Den said. Not formally. He has asked that it be arranged privately. When? She said. Now. He is already here. He used the back road. She put down her inventory. She smoothed her apron. She thought, briefly, about the fact that she was wearing her work clothes and had been in the supply stores since early morning, and that her hair was doing something she had not checked on since before breakfast. Then she decided that none of this was information she was going to give weight to. She followed Den. The visitor had been shown to one of the smaller meeting rooms at the back of the compound, not the great hall, not the formal reception spaces, a room used for quiet meetings that didn't require ceremony. Den had arranged this, which meant Oren's household did not yet know the visitor was here. Mira came in. Den waited outside. The woman who stood in the small room was not someone she recognized. She was perhaps 35, with the contained energy of someone used to moving quickly between situations that required different things from them. She was dressed practically, and the way she stood told Mira that she was someone the king trusted with things that needed to be handled correctly. Mira, the woman said, as though confirming a fact she already had. Yes, Mira said. My name is Ada. I serve as private secretary to Kale Dre. I'm here because of the documents you sent through the secondary courier last month. She looked at Mira steadily. The meeting records. Yes. They were significant. Ada paused, choosing her next words with visible care. They were significant enough that the king wanted me here in person rather than by written correspondence. Mira waited. What you sent confirmed a specific account of the consolidation decisions that has been partially evidenced in the Royal Archive but never fully sourced, Ada said. The Blackwood Pax records represent the most complete set of primary meeting documentation that anyone has found. If they still exist, the originals, they would be the most important historical evidence currently available on the question of the Caliph reclassification. They exist, Mira said. I showed them to the secondary archivist. He verified the location and condition. Ada nodded. He sent his own letter, separately, confirming this. Mira had not known that. She filed it away with a feeling that was warmer than she expected. Den being Den, quiet and thorough and behaving exactly as the person he was. What is needed, Ada said, is for those records to be formally documented and secured under royal charter before they disappear, which they will, if the Alpha of Blackwood understands what they contain. Mira thought about Oren's face when she had mentioned the records in the Great Hall. The cold cross of expression she had seen. He already suspects what they contain, she said. He removed the ledgers from the active records room. He did not know about the old building. How long do we have? Ada asked. Not urgently. Practically, as though calculating a timeline. I don't know. He has not moved against the old building yet, which means either he doesn't know it's relevant or he is choosing not to act on it until the formal review process is further along. Then we need to act before either of those conditions changes. Ada looked at her. I am authorized, under Royal Charter, to take formal custody of documents relevant to an active royal review. If you show me where these records are, I can document and seal them today. Under royal seal, they cannot be moved, removed, or altered by any individual pack authority. Mira stood with this for a moment. She thought about the ledger she had found on the lowest shelf, the meeting minutes, the names in those minutes, the specific, deliberate, clear-eyed decision to erase something true for the benefit of people who had long since died. All right, she said. She took Ada to the old library building. Den came with them. Ada spent 40 minutes with the materials, documenting each item in a formal record that she sealed with the Royal Charter stamp. She handled the ledgers with careful professionalism, reading them quickly and thoroughly in the way of someone accustomed to processing large amounts of information fast. When she finished, she placed the royal seal documentation alongside the physical materials. She looked at Mira. They are now under royal custody. The Alpha of Blackwood cannot legally move them without royal authorization. She paused. This does not mean he will not try. I know, Mira said. Is there anything else in this compound that is relevant to your case? Mira thought of Dr. Harwood's medical assessment of Drek's wound. She thought of Gil's witness account, which she knew he had put in writing because he had told her so. She thought of Clara and Owen and Priya and the small gathering of people who had, over the past month, become the witnesses she had needed. Yes, she said. People. Ada looked at her. Testimony? From multiple witnesses. To the events at the river, to the Great Hall meeting, to the archive letter. Den has records of everything that arrived through official channels. Ada made a note. I will need to speak with each of them, individually, and only if they are willing, nothing compelled. She looked at Mira. Can that be arranged without going through the Alpha's household? Mira thought about the covered walkway, about the kitchen, about the places in this compound that Oren officially owned, but practically did not control. Yes, she said. They spent the rest of the afternoon in those places. Ada moved through the compound with the particular quality of someone who is being deliberately unobtrusive, not hiding, but not announcing. Den guided them through the secondary corridors. Mira introduced them to the people who had told her they would speak. Gil met them in the workshop behind the stables, which was his space. He was direct and factual and gave his account of the river incident with the steady clarity of someone who had decided, some time ago, to tell the truth about it whenever asked. Ada documented every word. Priya met them in the library building itself, which was her idea. She had a quality, Mira noticed, of being able to perform complete normalcy in any setting while actually doing something entirely different. She was very good at the social camouflage that pack life required, and she had chosen to deploy it in this direction rather than the other. She gave her account of the Great Hall meeting, including the specific exchange with Oren, and she did it with the same clear directness that had made her stand up in the first place. Owen gave a quieter, more reserved account, but it was thorough. He had read the original ledger on the third shelf. He knew what it said. He confirmed it in writing. Dr. Harwood was the last. She met them in the small treatment room off the main hall, which was technically her space and therefore entirely under her own authority. She sat with both hands on the table in front of her and looked at Ada. I wrote a report for Oren stating that Drek's constitution was unusually strong, she said. That report is inaccurate. I wrote it inaccurate on purpose because I made a judgment, in the moment, about what was safest. That was not a courageous decision. Ada waited. I have written a second accurate report, Dr. Harwood said, which describes what I found when I examined Drek on the morning after the incident. I would like that report to be part of the official record. She slid a sealed envelope across the table. I would also like the first report to be noted as inaccurate in any formal documentation. Ada took the envelope. Noted, she said. Dr. Harwood looked at Mira. I am sorry it took me this long. You are doing it now, Mira said. It was the best she could offer. It was also true. By the time Ada concluded her work and prepared to leave, the afternoon light was almost gone. Den had ensured that the record of Ada's official visit was logged, properly, under her title and the Royal Charter reference, in the compound's official ledger. Oren would see it when he reviewed the day's entries. Ada spoke to Mira at the back gate, briefly and privately. The king is aware of the full current situation, she said. He will be making a formal visit to the compound within the next 6 weeks. Mira said nothing. He wanted me to tell you directly, rather than through correspondence. Ada looked at her with the expression of someone delivering the part of the message that was not official. He said to tell you that the visit is not primarily about the documents. Mira thought about the handwritten line in the archive letter, about the note under her door, about the question at the end of the official correspondence. Tell him the seedlings are fine, she said. Ada's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted in a way that was almost amused. "I will tell him exactly that," she said. She rode out the back gate as the last light went, and Mira watched the gate close and stood for a moment in the cold. 6 weeks. She had 6 weeks before the shape of things changed again. She went to the kitchen and helped with the evening meal. She spoke to Clara, to Gil when he came in from the stables. She ate her dinner and cleared her plate and said goodnight to the people who were now in the habit of saying it back. She lay in her bed that night and thought not about the visit, not about Oren, not about the formal review or the royal charter, or the documents now sealed under the stamp that made them untouchable. She thought about the question Ada had delivered from a man she had met 5 times, who had appeared in her greenhouse in the near dark and stood still long enough to look at what she had built, and who had asked, 3 weeks later at a formal gate farewell, with his beta 2 steps behind him, that she not let them make her smaller than she was. She thought about what it meant that someone had asked that, not as an instruction, as a request, as something they hoped for, not something they commanded. She pressed her hands flat on the blanket over her chest. She felt the current, the second pulse, steady in the dark. She was not smaller than she was. She had not been, not once, not ever, even when she had allowed herself to be seen that way. That was the thing she had known, all along, in the wordless place where true things lived. She closed her eyes. She was ready. The 6 weeks that followed Ada's visit were the strangest of Mira's life, in the specific way that periods of waiting are strange when the thing being waited for is large. Time moved unevenly, some days collapsing to almost nothing and others stretching out to twice their usual length, and all of it had the quality of something holding its breath. The compound held its breath too. Oren was aware of Ada's visit. The log entry made sure of that. He was aware of the royal charter seals on the library building documents. He was aware that formal testimony had been given by named individuals within his pack. None of this was hidden from him. It could not have been hidden without the kind of active suppression that would itself have constituted a violation of the royal charter. He did not act against any of the witnesses. She had expected him to, in the small ways that were hardest to demonstrate, the quiet reassignments, the inconveniences, the social levers pulled. He did not. Whether this was wisdom or restraint or simply uncertainty about what the king's office would or would not tolerate, she could not be sure. What she knew was that the people who had given testimony continued to move through the compound without obvious consequence, and that this was a notable change from the month before. The compound's social temperature had settled into something that was not quite acceptance and not quite hostility. It was closer to watchfulness, the particular attention of a community that has recognized something in itself as unresolved and is waiting for the resolution to reveal what it requires of them. She understood this. She had lived in this compound for 14 years, and she knew what collective deference looked like before it committed in a direction. They were waiting. They were waiting because she was waiting, and because Oren was waiting, and because somewhere to the north the king was preparing a visit that everyone in the compound now knew was not routine. She continued her work. She had been doing this for weeks now, maintaining the same rhythm, the same tasks, the same presence, not as performance and not as cover, but because the work was her work, and it was hers, and she was not going to stop doing it, because the world around it had become complicated. She cleaned and carried and cooked and catalogued. She spoke to the people who spoke to her, which were more people now than before, and she answered honestly and said what was true, and let the rest be. She was in the covered walkway on a clear, cold afternoon, 3 weeks before the visit, when Drek came to find her. He came alone, which she noted. No beta aide, no companion. He walked with his usual confidence, the kind that was in his bones rather than performed, but there was something slightly different in his approach, a fraction of the certainty dialed down, or perhaps just replaced by something else. She did not stop what she was doing. She waited. He stood a few feet away. He looked at her with the same directness he brought to most things. "I want to speak with you," he said. Direct, no preamble. "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment, as though assembling something. "I told people about the river," he said. "Immediately, without asking what you wanted. You had asked me not to tell anyone, and I told everyone." "Yes," she said. "I don't know if I would make a different decision," he said. "What happened was, it happened, and I was not going to pretend I imagined it." He looked at her. "But I understand that it cost you something. Whatever safety you had, the choosing of when to say it. I took that from you." She had thought about this more than once over the past weeks. She had thought about whether she was angry at Drek for speaking, and she had concluded, with the kind of honesty she tried to bring to things she had a stake in, that she was not. He had seen something extraordinary and he had spoken. She would likely have done the same. What she was, she had decided, was unsurprised. And there was a kind of dignity in that, in being the person whose reaction to the way things went was, of course, rather than, how could you? You saw something true, she said. You spoke about something true. The cost I paid was the cost of having hidden the truth in the first place, not the cost of it being seen. He looked at her for a moment, trying to find something to disagree with, and not finding it. I heard what you said in the hall, he said. About what you are. The designation. Yes. Do you think it's true? The history of it, the erasure. Yes, she said. I have read the primary sources. The meeting minutes of the people who made the decision. They knew exactly what they were doing. He sat down on the walkway step, which was not what she had expected. He sat the way people sit when they are no longer sure of the architecture of a situation and are processing downward rather than upward. My father's family line is in those minutes, he said. She had wondered when this would arrive. Yes, she said. Not as witnesses, he said. As participants. Yes. He sat with this. She let him sit with it. It was not a small thing to sit with. He knows, Drek said finally. He has always known. Not the specifics. He probably didn't know the records existed in the old building. But the general shape of it. The reason the Omega designation was what it was. He knows more than he says. Most of the people who have held power in this compound for a long time know more than they say, Mira said. That is often the mechanism by which they hold it. Drek looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at her. What do you want? The question surprised her, in the sense that it was the first time anyone in the Blackwood compound had asked it of her, with what appeared to be genuine interest in the answer. She thought about it honestly. Not the tactical answer, not the political one, the true one. I want the record corrected, she said. My classification, the history that was removed. I want the people who are carrying the wrong designation because of decisions made before they were born to have access to the truth. I want what was erased to be written back. She paused. I do not want to remove anyone from their position. I do not want to replace the hierarchy with a different version of the same error. I want the truth to be the ground that things grow from. Drek was very still. That sounds simple, he said. It is simple, she said. It is also the hardest possible thing. He nodded slowly. He stood. He looked at her one more time, with the directness that was, she had decided, his most honest quality. When the king comes, he said, I will give testimony. She had not expected this either. She stood with it for a moment. I know what I saw at the river, he said. I know what I owe. I will give testimony. He walked away. She watched him go. She thought about the word owe and what it meant coming from Drek, who had spent his entire life in the assumption that things moved from him outward, not inward. She thought about the current inside her, the anchor, the thing the old document had called connective, the ability to stabilize, to help things grow, to steady what was failing. She thought about whether that could extend to people as well as seedlings and wounds. She thought it probably already had, in small ways, in this compound, for years, without anyone including herself having a name for it. She went back to what she had been doing. The afternoon continued. The compound moved through its hours. 3 weeks. She could wait 3 weeks. She had been waiting her whole life. 3 weeks was nothing at all. He arrived on a Wednesday, in the first thin light of morning. Not as he had arrived before, not with a delegation and a formal procession and the compound assembling itself into a performance of welcome. He arrived with 4 riders and no advance notice, which was not an accident. It was the arrival of someone who wanted to see a place before it knew it was being seen. Mira was at the back gate when she heard the horses. She was carrying firewood from the eastern store to the kitchen, a 2-trip job she had taken on because the 2 people normally assigned to it had both woken ill. She heard the horses and she set down her load, and she stood in the early morning cold and she waited. The front gate guard's voice carried in the still air. Then a second voice she recognized, Ada, who she had not known was part of this visit. Then the gate opening. She picked up her firewood and went to the kitchen. She knew she would see him. She did not know when or in what configuration. She did not plan for it. She had learned that planning for specific moments was less useful than being fully present in whatever moment arrived, and she had enough to be present in right now. The firewood, the kitchen fire, the day's first tasks. She was stirring the morning porridge when Den appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression that told her the moment had arrived sooner than expected. He wants to see the greenhouse first, Den said. She looked at her spoon. She set it down. She took off her apron. The greenhouse was still locked. She had not been inside it since the month before the king's first visit. The lock that she herself had placed on Nora's instruction had never been removed. But Den had the groundskeeper's keys now, because Oren's control of the compound's secondary access had been one of the things quietly reorganized in the weeks following Ada's visit, and this key was among them. She went to the greenhouse. Den unlocked the door. She walked inside. She stopped. The seedlings were not knee-high anymore. They were the height of the ceiling. Every single one, in the months since she had been locked out, had grown to the full internal height of the greenhouse, their leaves spreading wide and flat and very dark green in the early morning light that came through the cracked glass panels. The space inside was not a storage room anymore. It was a garden. She stood in the middle of it and looked up. She heard the door behind her. She did not turn. "I thought you might want to see it before anyone else came in," Kale Dre said from the doorway. She turned then. He looked the same. That was her first thought, which she recognized immediately as the thought of someone who had been constructing a version of something in their memory, and was now checking it against the real thing. He was the same. He had the same stillness, the same quality of uncomplicated presence, the same way of standing in a space as though the space had always been expecting him. He looked at the plants. He walked in, moving carefully between them, and looked at the ceiling height leaves the way she had looked at them a minute before, with a kind of quiet astonishment that was not quite surprise. "They've been growing in a locked greenhouse," he said. "Yes," she said. "They do that." He looked at her. There was something different in this version of his expression, something that had not been there in the brief exchanges she had stored and returned to in the months since his first visit. It was not professional. It was not official. It was the expression of someone, in the presence of something they did not know exactly what to do with. She was looking at him with, she suspected, a similar expression. "I got your message," he said. "From Ada." "Good." "The seedlings are fine," he repeated. Those were the exact words. They were accurate. He almost smiled. It was brief, just a slight change at the corners of his mouth, and it changed his face in a way that made him look younger. "Mira," he said, and the way he said her name was different from how anyone had ever said it. Not the clipped functional acknowledgement that most people had begun using since the Great Hall, and not the formal correctness that Ada used. Just her name, as though it was a known thing, which it was to him, which she was still learning to account for. "I need to tell you what today is going to involve," he said. "I want you to know before it happens." She nodded. He told her. He was precise about it, which she appreciated. The formal gathering he had called, which Oren had not been able to refuse because it was called under royal charter. The testimony that would be given publicly, by the named witnesses, in a setting that was part of the official royal review. The formal documentation that would follow, the things that could be achieved today and the things that would still take time. He was honest about the limitations. The reassessment of her formal designation would take months to complete through the full process. The historical record could be formally acknowledged but could not be retroactively changed in every document. The cultural reality of the pack hierarchy, the deeply held, generationally established belief in rank as the fundamental unit of worth, would not dissolve in a day. "I know," she said. "What today is," he said carefully, "is the beginning of the public record. Once testimony is formally taken and documented in a royal charter proceeding, it cannot be undone. It is the version that will be referred to going forward." "I understand." He was quiet for a moment. He was standing between two of the tall plants, and the light through the glass panels was doing something to the air around him that made everything look slightly different from how it had a moment before. Warmer, she thought, which was interesting since the temperature in the greenhouse had not changed. "How are you?" he asked. The directness of it caught her off guard in a way that very little caught her off guard. Not because the question was complex, but because it was exactly what it was. A question. About her. From a person who wanted the honest answer. "Prepared," she said. He looked at her steadily. "That's not quite the same thing as how you are." She thought about it honestly. "I have been patient my whole life," she said. "Today I am the kind of patient that comes from having run out of alternatives, which is a different quality from the kind I started with. But the center of it is the same." He was quiet for a moment. "The center of it," he repeated. "The thing that does not change," she said, "no matter what the day involves." He looked at her for a long moment. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you said in the corridor. About how long you had been doing this, the healing, the growing, about how no one knew." "Yes. I have been thinking about what it costs," he said, "to know what you are and to make yourself invisible in order to survive it." She thought about the 14 years, the deliberate architecture of her invisibility, the daily decision to be less than the current because the current was too much for the room. "It costs," she said. But the alternative, being visible before the world had a frame for it, that would have cost more. I did the math. It was the right calculation for a long time. And now? Now, she said. The frame exists, or it is being built. She looked at him steadily. I am not going back. Something in his expression settled, not relief exactly. Something like certainty, the arrival of confirmation for something already suspected. Good, he said. They stood in the greenhouse in the early morning light with the ceiling-height plants around them, and the silence between them was the kind she had recognized since the first time it had been between them, the kind that didn't need to be filled. We should go in, she said. The gathering will be assembling. Yes, he said. He moved toward the door. She followed. He held the door open, which she noted not as significance but as habit, the habit of a person who opened doors for others as a default rather than a choice. She walked through the greenhouse door into the cold, clear morning. The compound was already different. She could feel it before she saw it. The air had the particular charge of a day when something irreversible is about to happen. Wolves were moving toward the central courtyard where the gathering would be held, in the small clusters and individual trajectories that characterized a pack pulled in multiple directions at once. She walked toward it too. She did not hurry. She moved at her own pace, which had always been hers, and she felt the current inside her. Steady, settled, not performing anything. At the edge of the courtyard, Clara was waiting. Not for Mira specifically. She was standing with a group of mid-ranked wolves, all of them oriented toward the courtyard. But she saw Mira approach and move to stand beside her, simply, as though this was where she had decided to be. Gil was there. Owen was there. Priya was already in the courtyard proper, near the front. Den was near the entrance to the main building, his records box under his arm, ready to document everything. Dr. Harwood stood alone near the east wall, her medical bag with her as always. She met Mira's eyes and gave a small, precise nod. Mira walked into the courtyard. She took her place, not at the edge, not near the walls, not in the position she had always occupied in every gathering since she was 7 years old. She stood in the middle of the open space, in the clear winter light, and she faced the gathered pack. Oren was across the courtyard. He had come. He'd had no choice about that. And he stood at the head of his household with the composure of a man who had been managing difficult situations for 20 years and was applying every resource of that experience to the current moment. His face gave nothing away. She looked at him. He looked at her. She had spent years waiting for this kind of moment to feel like something absolute, like vindication, like triumph, like the resolution she had been building toward. It did not feel like any of those things. It felt like what it was, a day in a compound, in winter, with cold light and solid ground underfoot. She was here. He was there. The testimony was about to begin. She breathed in. She breathed out. She was ready. Ada opened the formal proceeding. She stood at the center of the courtyard with her documentation materials and her official title and the particular authority that comes from being a representative of something larger than any individual present, and she explained, in clear and neutral language, what a royal charter testimony gathering was and what it was not. It was not, she said, a trial. No one was being charged. No judgment on any individual was being reached today. What was being established was a formal record, a documented account of witnessed events, historical evidence, and expert assessment that would be incorporated into the ongoing royal review of a designation matter. The record would be permanent, accessible to any future inquiry, and held in the Northern Archive. She asked if anyone in the gathered pack had a procedural question before testimony began. No one spoke. The courtyard was very still. Mira stood where she was, in the middle of the open space, and waited. Gil went first. Ada had arranged the order of testimony and had not consulted Mira about it, which was correct. Gil walked to the center of the courtyard with the same steady, uncomplicated energy he had brought to everything since the river. He gave his account. The patrol, the injury, Mira's arrival, what he had seen, what he had felt in his hands when she put hers over his, the rate at which the bleeding had stopped. He was precise. He did not embellish. He gave times and details, and the specific physical sensations involved. And when Ada asked clarifying questions, he answered them with the same directness. Around the courtyard, people listened. She could feel the listening, not just the polite attention of people waiting for their turn to speak, but the actual engagement of people hearing something and checking it against what they already knew. She could feel the places where it confirmed and the places where it complicated. Drek went second. He walked from his position at his father's side, and she saw the very small hesitation in Oren's expression as his son moved away from him, the fraction of a second in which he considered something and then released it, and he stood in the center of the courtyard and gave his account. His account was personal in a way that Gill's had been professional. He described his own experience, the injury, the moment he understood it was serious, the arrival of a face he recognized but had never truly seen, the 30 seconds before she touched him, in which he had been more afraid than he had ever been, and then what happened afterward. He did not describe what Mira had done in any technical terms. He described what it had been like to be on the receiving end of it, and the difference between the two approaches gave the testimony a completeness that technical description alone could not. He said, "She had asked me not to tell anyone. I told everyone anyway. I told everyone because I had seen something true and I did not know how to hold it quietly." He paused. "I understand now that the choice of when to reveal a truth belongs to the person living inside it. I am sorry for that." The courtyard was very still. He looked at Mira for a moment. She met his look without expression, but what she felt, carefully, privately, was something she filed under. This is what it looks like when a person chooses accurately. Dr. Harwood went third, and her testimony was the most technical and, in some ways, the most devastating in terms of its precision. She had written assessments, both the original inaccurate one and the corrected one, and she walked through the medical reality of Dreck's injury and recovery with the authority of a practitioner who had seen a great many injuries and understood what was and was not possible without assistance. She corrected her own first report on the record, clearly and without self-defense, and she documented what she had actually found. Ada noted the correction formally. It was now part of the record. The account had been initially falsified, and here was the medical professional who had falsified it, correcting it under oath. Priya went forth. She gave her account of the Great Hall meeting, specifically, the moment she had heard Mira say her name, and what it had looked like from where she was standing. She said something that was not in any of the documents or the formal account, which was, "I had told someone, the week before, that she was so invisible she barely registered as a person. I said this about a woman who was, at that same moment, keeping a greenhouse alive in winter with her bare hands. I said it because I had never looked." She stopped. "I looked in the hall. I looked when she said her name. She was completely clear." Mira breathed, very carefully. Owen gave a brief, factual account of his reading of the original ledger on the third shelf. Den documented the archive letter and the formal receipt. Ada summarized the meeting records from the old library, now under Royal Charter seal. Then there was a pause in the proceedings, and Ada looked at Mira. "You may speak," Ada said. "As the person at the center of this review, you are not required to. But you may." Mira had not planned what she would say, in the specific sense. She had thought about this moment, but she had learned from experience that planning the words of significant things in advance produced a kind of performance that was less convincing than honesty. She had decided she would say what was true. She walked to the center of the courtyard. She stood in the cold light. She looked at the gathered pack. She looked at Oren. She looked at the people who had come to find her in the kitchen, and at Dreck, and at Gill, and at Clara standing at the edge of the courtyard with her arms folded against the cold. She looked at Den with his records box. She looked at Cale Dre, who was standing at the side of the courtyard with Ada's secondary staff, positioned as a witness rather than a principal, watching with the attention he had always given to things that mattered. She said, "I am going to tell you what I have told very few people in my 14 years in this compound. I am going to tell you who I am." She did. She told them about what she could do, from the beginning, as far back as she had clear memory. She told them about the 17 years of hiding it, first in her earliest years wherever that had been, and then in this compound. She told them about the greenhouse, which she could see from where she was standing, the plants visible through the cracked glass, reaching the ceiling in the cold. She told them about the ledger, and about the designation that had been removed from the formal system by a council whose minutes named families still represented in this pack. She did not say this as an accusation. She said it as a fact. She said, "I am not asking you to give me anything. I am not asking for a position or a status, or a new rank in the system as it currently stands. I am asking for the record to be corrected. I am asking for the truth to be the ground that things stand on. I am asking for the people who come after me, the ones who are growing in broken greenhouses right now, in compounds like this one, being told they are nothing, to have a word for what they are." She paused. "My name is Mira," she said. "That is the only name I have ever been given. I do not have a family name or a lineage title or any of the markers that would make me legible to this pack's hierarchy on its own terms. I have only what I can do, and what I am, and the truth of how that was handled by the people who should have handled it correctly." She looked at Oren one more time. His face was the same face it had always been, controlled, experienced, entirely closed. "I am not angry," she said, and she meant it. "I am finished being invisible." She walked back to her place. The courtyard was silent for a long moment. Ada spoke. She formally closed the testimony portion of the proceedings and began the notation of the record. The gathering remained, most of them, standing or sitting in the courtyard while Den and Ada processed the documentation. People spoke in small groups. No one left. At some point during this, she was not tracking the exact sequence. Cale Dray crossed the courtyard and came to stand beside her. He did not say anything for a moment. He stood with her in the cold and looked at the gathered pack and the winter sky, and the compound that had been her whole world for 14 years. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about it. "Like someone who has just put down something very heavy," she said, "and is still figuring out what to do with their hands." He looked at her then. He looked at her the way he had looked at the seedlings in the greenhouse, with attention that was complete and specific, and not performing anything. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, so it was only to her, "you have been carrying it without putting it down for a very long time, and I do not think most people could have done it the way you did." She looked at him. "Is that meant to be comforting?" "Yes," he said. "Is it?" She thought about it honestly. "A little," she said. He almost smiled again. The almost smile that changed his face. She was beginning to catalog it. The shape of it. The specific quality. The way it arrived without ceremony and left the same way. "Good," he said. They stood in the courtyard together in the cold morning, not far apart, while around them the compound processed the day that had arrived in it, and the documentation was completed, and the record was made. She stood in it without hiding. She stood in it with her name and her history and the current inside her, steady as always, and she let it be seen. All of it. The bow happened the next morning. She had not expected it. She had not been warned. It was not part of any formal proceeding or protocol. It was not something Ada had included in her outline of the visit's events. It happened the way some of the most significant things happen, without a program, without ceremony, on an ordinary morning while the day was doing something else. Mira was crossing the central courtyard with a message from Den for the secondary archivist's record store. The message was in her hand. The morning was cold and clear. The winter sky the particular flat blue of early December. The courtyard had perhaps 15 people in it, not a gathering, just the compound's natural flow at mid-morning, people with places to go and things to carry and the ordinary business of a living community. Cale Dray came out of the main hall and into the courtyard. She heard the door and looked up, because the door to the main hall had a specific sound she had learned 14 years ago. He was alone. Ada was elsewhere. His other staff were elsewhere. He had come out of the main hall because he had been inside, and now he was outside, which was ordinary. He was not in formal dress. He was wearing the same practical dark clothing she had first seen him in. He saw her from across the courtyard. He changed direction. The 15 people in the courtyard continued what they were doing. Most of them were not paying attention to the king's movements, which was not possible in the way it would not be possible to stop tracking a large and very still animal that had walked into your peripheral vision. Everyone knew he was there, but everyone was performing the courtesy of not staring. He crossed the courtyard. He stopped in front of her. She was holding her message. She stood the way she always stood, with her weight even, her attention clear, not performing anything. He looked at her for a moment. The expression on his face was one she had no category for. It was not the professional attention she had seen in their corridor conversation. It was not the focused stillness of his listening. It was something more personal and more direct, something that she would have identified as significant, even if she had not already known it was. Then he bowed. He brought his hands together at his chest level, palms pressed, and he inclined forward. Not a slight, courteous nod, but a full bow, the kind that in the pack tradition she had grown up inside carried specific, unmistakable meaning. It was the bow given to something with authority that preceded one's own. It was the bow that said, "What you carry is older and more fundamental than what I carry, and I recognize this." In the courtyard, the 15 people who had been performing the courtesy of not watching stopped performing it. Every head turned. She did not move for a moment. She held the message in her hand and stood in the winter light and absorbed what was happening. He straightened. He looked at her with the directness that was his most consistent quality. "I am sorry it took this long," he said. "For what it's worth, I am listening now. I have been listening since the greenhouse." The courtyard was silent, not the silence of shock, the silence of a collective breath held while something resolves, while the world adjusts to a new shape. She thought of everything she could have said in that moment. She thought of the 14 years. She thought of the small room with the narrow window and the bucket and the 3-row cup arrangement, and the word "you" used as a name. She thought of the ledger on the lowest shelf and the cloth marker that had been placed there for her to find. She thought of the current inside her, steady and old and real. She said, "I know." 2 words. They were the right words because they were true. She had known since the greenhouse, since the corridor, since the note under her door and the question about seedlings in the margin of an official letter. She had known she was being seen, properly, by someone who had decided to look. The bow was the form of a truth that had been real for months. He heard the 2 words for what they were. His expression changed in the particular way that she was becoming, quietly and without announcement, very familiar with, the settling, the confirmation, the thing that looked like arrival. "Good," he said. Around the courtyard, people were very still. She could feel it. The holding of breath, the adjustment of a collective picture. The Alpha King had bowed to the Omega who cleaned the floors. Every person present was processing what this meant, and what it required of them, and what it made undeniable. She let them process it. She looked at Kale Dre. "I have something to ask you," she said. "Yes," he said. "The formal review," she said. "The reassessment. The months of process. I understand why it is structured the way it is. I understand the necessary slowness of documentation and official change." "Yes," he said, listening. "Is there anything in the process that could acknowledge, before the full reassessment is complete, that the designation as it stands is provisional? Not the final word. Not the record but the daily reality." He was quiet for a moment. "In practical terms," he said, "what would that mean to you?" She thought about it. "I would like to be able to enter the greenhouse," she said, "without requiring permission, without a lock that belongs to someone else." It was a small thing. She said the small thing because the small thing was the honest one, because after 14 years, what she wanted before the large formal transformation was the daily ordinary right to go where her work was without someone else controlling the door. He looked at her. He said, "The greenhouse is yours. As of this morning, it is documented under the secondary archivist's records as a working space under your custodianship. Den handled it yesterday, at my request." She had not known. She felt something move in her. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just the particular release of something long held. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He did not make it larger than it was. She appreciated this more than she could have said. The courtyard had begun to breathe again around them. People were moving, the ordinary rhythm of the morning reasserting itself around the extraordinary thing that had just happened, which was how extraordinary things always integrated into ordinary days. Priya was near the main door. She was looking at Mira with an expression that was impossible to categorize exactly but that had warmth in it, and recognition, and something adjacent to pride in the way that pride can belong to someone who simply witnessed a thing being done correctly. Drek was at the far edge of the courtyard. He was looking at his father's household's wing of the building, and she could see, from across the space, the particular quality of a person deciding something. Gil was coming out of the stables. He saw her. He raised one hand, not a greeting exactly, more an acknowledgement, the gesture between people who know that the same important thing has happened to both of them. Clara was not there. She would find out later, from Clara herself, that she had been watching from the upper window of the residential building and had seen the whole thing, and that the particular sound she had made when she saw the bow was not something she had a word for, but that it involved leaning against the window frame for a considerable amount of time. Mira crossed the courtyard and delivered Den's message to the record store. She came back through the courtyard. She went to the greenhouse. The key was not needed. The lock was gone. Removed, she could see, not long ago. The door opened with the familiar complaint of the hinges. She stepped inside. The plants reached the ceiling, green and very much alive in the cold morning light. She walked between them. She put her hands in the soil at the base of the largest one, and she felt the familiar current move, steady, exactly where it had always been. She was in there for a while. She was not thinking about the bow or the testimony, or the formal review or any of the things that would take months and require patience she had already proven she possessed. She was thinking about the specific quality of soil that was alive, and the particular way it responded to her hands, and the fact that she was in her greenhouse, which was hers, and she had not had to ask permission or wait for someone to unlock a door that should never have been locked. She was in the greenhouse when she heard the door. She did not look up immediately. She was finishing what she was doing. When she did look up, Kale Dre was standing in the doorway again, the way he had stood in it months ago when the plants were shorter and they had not yet spoken. He was looking at the ceiling height leaves. "They grew this tall while the door was locked," he said. "Yes," she said. "I told them to." He looked at her. "Not in words," she said, "but I told them." He walked into the greenhouse. He moved between the plants with the careful attention he brought to everything, the attention that did not rush, that did not perform. He stopped near her. He looked at the largest plant, then at her. "What happens now?" he said. The question was personal. Not about the review, not about the designation, not about the formal record. She had thought about this. She had thought about it in the covered walkway, and in the kitchen, and lying in the dark and standing in the courtyard while the bow happened, and everything she had known was adjusting itself around a new shape. "The process continues," she said. "The months of documentation, the record being built, the truth being made legible." She paused. "And I will keep doing my work, because the work is mine, and it is real, and it does not require anyone's permission to be worth doing." He looked at her steadily. "And beyond the process," he said, "beyond the work." She met his look. She thought about the notes in the margin of official letters, and the specific quality of a question asked in a greenhouse in the near dark, and the sentence at the gate, "Do not let them make you smaller than you are." "I haven't decided yet," she said. "About the invitation." He did not pretend not to know what invitation she meant. "Take your time," he said. "I will," she said. "I'm very good at waiting." "I know," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, the same two words she had said to him in the courtyard, reflected back with the same weight, that she felt in her chest in a way she did not immediately categorize but did not need to. She filed it away with the other things she was taking her time with. He stayed in the greenhouse for a while longer. They did not talk for all of it. The silence was what it had always been, the kind that did not need to be filled. Outside, the compound was going about its day. The people in it were adjusting, each in their own way and at their own rate, to the version of the morning that included a king's bow in a courtyard, to a woman who had cleaned their floors for 14 years. Some of them were adjusting well, some would take longer. Some of the older wolves who were most invested in the existing order would not adjust at all, and that was a reality she was not naive about. But the record existed, the documents were sealed under royal charter. The testimony was given, formally, permanently, in the language that official things live in. The history was written back in. She was in her greenhouse. The door was not locked. The current inside her was steady. She had said, "I am not going back." She was not. The afternoon of the Bows Day was the beginning of the next thing, which was not an ending but a different kind of continuing. Oren called no gathering. He made no public statement. He did what people with his particular kind of experience do, when a situation has moved outside their ability to control, through the methods they have always used. He went very quiet, and very still, and he waited to see what the shape of things settled into, so he could understand what the new available options were. She respected this, in the specific, limited way she respected effective strategy. He was not finished. She did not expect him to be finished. The formal review would give him 3 months of administrative process in which to contest and challenge and delay, and he would use every day of those 3 months. She was prepared for this. What she was not prepared for, and what arrived that afternoon with the characteristic quality of things that matter, was Cole. Cole was Oren's most senior beta. He had worked alongside Oren for 15 years, advised him, organized his household, been present at every significant decision. He was not a man she had ever spoken to directly. He was not a man she had expected to seek her out. He found her in the covered walkway, where she seemed to encounter significant things with reliable frequency, as though the walkway itself had developed a habit. He was not there with Oren's knowledge. She could tell this immediately, from the slightly different quality of how he was standing. Not the beta in official capacity posture, but something less defined, someone moving outside their usual role. "I heard the testimony," he said. "Most people did," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I have worked for Oren for 15 years, he said. "I have been in this compound for 15 years. And in that time I have done what I have been asked to do, and I have not questioned the reasons I was given for doing it." She waited. "The council minutes," he said. "The ones from the old building. I want you to know that I did not know they existed. I am telling you this not to remove my responsibility for the broader situation, but because the specific information, the actual record of the decisions made, I did not know." She looked at him steadily. "What would you have done if you had known?" He was quiet for a longer time. It was an honest question and he was giving it honest consideration. "I don't know," he said. "I would like to believe I would have done differently. I am uncertain enough about that belief that I am not going to state it as fact." She appreciated this. She appreciated it quite a lot. "Then what are you telling me?" "I am telling you," he said, "that in the formal review process, I will not be working against your account. I will not be advancing a counter-narrative. I cannot promise more than that, but I am not willing to do less. She looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. He nodded. He left. She stood in the walkway for a moment. She thought about the small pieces that the full picture was assembled from, not the large gestures, not the bow in the courtyard, not the testimony of the named witnesses. The small pieces, Cole coming to find her, Dr. Harwood correcting her own report on the record, Drek sitting down on a step in the compound's covered walkway and asking what she wanted. These were the things that would accumulate into something real. She had always understood that large visible change was the surface of a deeper movement, and the deeper movement was made of exactly these small convergences, individual people, one at a time, making the decision to look accurately. She continued her day. She was called to the main building to speak with Ada for an hour about the documentation timeline. Ada was efficient and thorough and gave her a clear picture of what the next 3 months would involve, without softening any of the difficulty in it. Mira listened and asked practical questions and noted the things she needed to track. Cale was leaving the following morning. She knew this. It had been in Ada's outline of the visit from the beginning. She found him that evening in the old library building, which was becoming, she noted, a recurring venue for their significant conversations. He was looking at the third shelf, the original ledger in its place, with the cloth marker still visible. He had not taken anything. He was simply looking. She came to stand beside him. The formal record will reference this building specifically, he said. It will be noted in the Royal Archive as a site of primary documentation. Den will appreciate that, she said. He almost smiled. You have a very dry way of responding to significant things. It keeps me from getting ahead of myself. He looked at the shelf for another moment. Then he looked at her. I leave tomorrow, he said. I know. The review process is managed from the King's office. I will be in contact through the official channels, and Ada will handle most of the procedural correspondence. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The lamplight in the library was warm and steady and made the old books look exactly like what they were, things that had survived long enough to matter. I had a question, he said. A genuine one, not official. She waited. The greenhouse, he said. The plants that grew in a locked room without your attention for months, because whatever you had put into them was enough to sustain them. He looked at her. Does that always work? When you care for something, does it continue even when you are not there? She thought about the seedlings in the cold. She thought about the soil she had pressed her hands into before the door was locked, the things she had put there that she could not name but that had been enough. It depends on the thing being cared for, she said, and how much it wants to grow. He held her look for a moment. I see, he said. She did not look away. She was done looking away from things that were clear. He left the library. She stayed for a few minutes, in the quiet, among the old books and the lamplight. She thought about what was coming, and what had happened, and the distance between them, which was shorter than she had expected and longer than she would have liked. She was not going to rush. Rushing was not her nature. She was, in almost every sense that mattered, someone built for the long work, the patient, consistent, in the dark and cold work that continued whether or not anyone was watching. She walked back through the compound to the residential building. She said goodnight to Clara, who was in the kitchen eating late. She went to her room. She lay in the dark. She thought about the bow. She thought about 2 words given and 2 words returned. She thought about an invitation that she had said she hadn't decided about, which was not entirely accurate. She had decided, she just had not said so, because some things needed to be held for the right moment, the way you hold a seed before the soil is ready. The soil was not quite ready, but it was close. She closed her eyes. The compound was quiet around her, and the winter air was cold outside the walls, and the greenhouse was unlocked, and the record existed, and the current inside her was steady as it had always been and would always be. Old, real, hers. She slept. She did not dream. She simply rested, which was its own kind of thing, which she had not allowed herself properly in a very long time. 1 month after Cale Dre left, the formal reassessment notice arrived. Not the completion of the process. That would take 2 more months, true to Ada's timeline. But the formal initiation. The official document, sealed with the royal charter stamp, delivered through the secondary courier who came on the 15th of each month, addressed to Mira and to the secondary archivist of the Blackwood compound, and to the regional oversight office that sat above individual pack authority. Den came to find her with it, as he had with the first archive letter. He was calmer this time. They had both learned to handle the significant things with less ceremony. She read it standing in the supply stores. It was dense with formal language and procedural references, What it meant, stripped of that language, was, the process is real, it has begun, and no individual pack authority can stop it. She folded it. She put it in her apron pocket. She finished cataloging the winter firewood. The 2 months that followed had a different quality from everything that had come before them. They were not easy months. Oren's household made full use of every administrative mechanism available to them to complicate and delay the process, and she spent a significant portion of each week responding to requests for additional documentation, clarifying testimony, providing written accounts of things she had already provided oral accounts of. Den was her strongest support in this work, moving through the archival demands with the methodical precision of someone who had been waiting his whole professional life to have a problem that was exactly this kind of problem. She was not alone in the work. She was still learning, in small daily increments, that not being alone was a condition that had to be actively maintained rather than simply claimed. She had to ask for help, which was not natural to her and required practice. She had to receive help when it was offered, without redirecting it, or declining it out of the reflex of 14 years. This was the hardest part of the 2 months in some ways, not the bureaucracy, but the daily recalibration of a person who had operated in complete self-sufficiency for so long that accepting support felt like a structural change rather than a simple transaction. She practiced it. Clara brought her meals when she was too deep in documentation to come to the kitchen. Gil passed her information about the patrol boundaries that was relevant to the formal record. Priya, who had a better understanding of Oren's administrative strategy than anyone except Oren himself, quietly signaled when something needed attention before it became a problem. She let them. She said thank you and meant it. From the king's office, correspondence arrived with regular frequency. Most of it was official: procedural updates, documentation requests, timeline confirmations. Ada handled most of it, but each letter, at the bottom, below the official close, had a handwritten line that was never official. The first: the Northern Archive confirms the consolidation meeting records are now part of the historical permanent record. The second: I am told Den's archival work on this case has set a new standard for documentation thoroughness. Please tell him I said so. The third, which arrived near the end of the second month: there are 3 wolf packs in the Northern Territory alone who have contacted this office since the testimony record was filed, requesting similar reassessments. I thought you should know. She sat with the third one for a long time. She thought about the people she had imagined when she stood in the courtyard and said what she wanted, the ones growing in broken greenhouses right now, in compounds like this one, being told they are nothing. She had not known if those people existed. She had said it as a principle, as the truest way she knew to explain what she was asking for. The evidence that they were real, and that they were already beginning to move because there was now a word and a record and a process. This was a thing that required more time to absorb than most things she had encountered. She did not cry. She had learned to do that alone, later, where it was only hers. She did, eventually, find that particular private space and use it, and what she felt in it was not the tight-throated grief of someone in pain, but the different, more complicated variety that arrives when something you have wanted for so long that you stopped expecting it finally happens. The formal reassessment was completed on a Thursday in early spring. The document that arrived was different from the previous official letters. It was heavier. It was in a case rather than an envelope. The secondary courier delivered it with both hands and a specific gravity that he had probably been instructed to convey. Den opened the case. He looked at the document inside. He handed it to Mira. She read it. Her designation was formally recorded as Kalith, with a full historical acknowledgement of the previous misclassification, the date of her original assignment to the Omega designation, and the specific historical circumstances that had produced that error. The document referred to the Great Consolidation by name and confirmed the finding that the Kalith designation had been removed from the formal classification system in a manner that had resulted in widespread historical misclassification. Her name was in the document. Her full name, which the document had solved the absence of in the manner of official documents that deal with historical correction: Mira, Kalith designation, formerly of Blackwood Pack, record date corrected, formerly. She read that word twice. Den, who had been watching her face with the careful attention of a man who understood that moments sometimes required witnesses, said, "Formally, under the reassessment, you are no longer under the authority of any individual pack's alpha designation. Your classification sits outside that structure." "I know," she said. She had read all of this. She understood what it meant. "What will you do?" he asked. She had been thinking about this for 2 months. She had been thinking about it in the careful, unhurried way she thought about things that required full honesty. "I want to go to the greenhouse first," she said. He nodded. He sat down at his desk and began the formal registration of the receipt of the document, which was what Den did with significant moments. He gave them the most appropriate form of care he had, which was documentation. She walked to the greenhouse. The door was unlocked, had been since the king's visit, since the morning of the bow. The plants were still there, still growing. She had been in every morning since. The space had changed over the months. She had cleared it properly, repaired 2 of the worst glass panels, installed a small heating pipe repair that Owen had helped her arrange. It looked, now, like a place that was being maintained, like a place that mattered. She sat down on the small wooden stool she had brought in weeks ago, and put her hands in the soil and felt the current move, the way it always moved, steady and real. She thought about the 3 other packs who had contacted the king's office. She thought about the people in those packs, the ones carrying something they had no name for, living inside a designation that did not describe them, doing the daily work of survival in a world that had been built to overlook them. She thought about what she could do. Not in the abstract, she had been thinking in the abstract for months. In the specific. She could travel. She had no formal obligation to the Blackwood compound under the reassessment. The document made clear she was no longer subject to Oren's authority. She could take her knowledge of the Caliph history and the documented process she had helped establish, and she could bring it to the packs who had reached out. She could help identify. She could help name. This was not the same as healing a wound or growing a plant, but it was the same kind of work in its root, helping living things get access to the conditions they needed. She was in the greenhouse when she heard the door, and this time she was not surprised. She had known, from the quality of the morning, that today would bring him. She had learned, slowly, that she had an instinct for his presence the way she had an instinct for most living things, a sense of them before she saw them. Cale Dre came through the greenhouse door. He was not alone this time. Ada was outside. She could hear the sound of horses at the front gate, the compound beginning to respond to an arrival. He was dressed formally. This was a formal visit. But he had come to the greenhouse first. He looked at her sitting on her stool with her hands in the soil. He looked at the plants reaching the ceiling. He looked at the repaired glass panel and the small heating pipe and the evidence of a space that had been cared for consistently. "You've been working on it," he said. "It's mine," she said. "That's what you do with things that are yours." He looked at her for a moment. He walked into the space, between the plants, and stopped near her the way he had always stopped near her, close enough to speak without performing closeness, far enough that nothing was assumed. "The document arrived this morning," he said. "Yes," she said. "Den logged it." And she looked up at him. She thought about the seed she had been holding, about the soil being ready. "I am going to travel," she said. "To the 3 packs who have reached out, and others probably, as the process becomes more established. I want to help identify and document." She held his look. "I will need resources for that, official support, the kind that makes the work legible to the packs I am going to." He was listening in the way he always listened, fully, without performing anything. "All right," he said. "That will require a formal arrangement," she said. "With your office." "Yes," he said. "It will." She looked at him. "That is one thing," she said. "There is another." "Yes," he said, and she could see that he already knew what the other was, and that he was going to let her say it because she deserved to say it in her own words at her own pace. "The invitation," she said, "to come, as myself, for whatever that meant." She paused. "I have decided what it means." He waited. "It means that I want to come," she said, "and I want to do the work I described, and I want to be in correspondence with someone who asks about seedlings at the bottom of official letters, and I want to not be an omega in your territory, and I want to not be a formal designation in your territory either. I want to be Mira, who is Caliph, and who has her own work, and who is choosing to be where she chooses to be." She held his look. "I want those things to be compatible. I am asking you if they are." He did not pause before answering, which was its own kind of answer. "Yes," he said. "They are." She nodded. She took her hands out of the soil. She stood up from the stool. They looked at each other in the greenhouse, in the spring light that was coming through the cleared glass panels, warm and real and nothing like the cold through which all of this had begun. She was not the same person who had been in this greenhouse in the autumn, looking at knee-high seedlings and hearing footsteps at the gate and making herself invisible. She was not the person who had spent 14 years behind a wall of her own construction, patient and precise and completely alone. She was also, in every way that was foundational, exactly herself. The current was where it had always been. The work was still the work. The truth was still the truth. She picked up her stool and carried it to the side of the greenhouse. "There is something I need to do this morning," she said. "Yes," he said. "Den needs to formally register the reassessment document. And I need to speak to the compound's mid-ranking wolves before word gets ahead of me. Because some of them will have questions, and they deserve to hear the answers from me. She looked at him steadily. Can you give me 2 hours before the formal visit proceedings begin? He almost smiled, the almost smile. She had catalogued it well enough now to recognize its variations, and this one was the version that meant, of course, without question, I would give you whatever time you needed. Yes, he said. Thank you, she said. She walked out of the greenhouse into the spring morning. The compound was coming alive around her. Word of the king's arrival was spreading, the particular sound of a pack adjusting to the presence of something important. She walked through it at her own pace, which had always been hers. She went to find Den first, then Clara, then Priya. She would speak to each of them, the people who had become, through the specific accumulation of honest moments, the ones she moved through the world alongside. She would speak to Drek, who had started sitting at the middle of the meal bench rather than the top, a small geographical choice that she understood as a large interior one. She would speak to Clara last, because Clara would want details, and would need time, and would probably have feelings about the travel plans that deserved a real conversation. She moved through the morning the way she had always moved, steadily, without hurry, with her weight even, and her attention clear, and nothing performed. The greenhouse was behind her, its door open, the plants inside continuing to grow in the direction that light came from, which was what all living things did when the conditions finally allowed it. She did not look back. She was not someone who looked back when she was moving forward. She walked into the day, and the day received her, and she was in it completely. Her name, her work, her designation, her decisions, the current inside her steady and old and undeniably, permanently hers. She had spent 14 years waiting for a door to open. She had learned that the waiting itself was not the problem. The problem was never the waiting. The problem was believing, as she had believed for much longer than she should have, that she was waiting for someone else to open it. The door had always been hers. She had simply needed the word for what was on the other side. The formal proceedings of Kale Dre's spring visit lasted 2 days. They were precise and complete, and handled by Ada with the same efficiency that had characterized everything she touched. The Blackwood compound's formal acknowledgement of the reassessment was documented. The protocol for the 3 other packs who had requested similar processes was established. Oren signed what needed to be signed, which he did with the controlled composure of someone who understood that some things could not be contested past a certain point, and that contesting past that point would cost him more than the signature. She was present for some of it, not all. The parts that were purely procedural did not require her, and she spent those hours doing what she had always done, the work of the compound, the daily ordinary things that had been hers for 14 years, and that she had no intention of stopping, simply because the world around them had changed. She did this deliberately, not because she was required to, but because the work was still the work, real and solid and hers, and because walking away from it just because she now had official permission not to do it would have been a capitulation to the idea that the work itself had been the punishment. It had not been. The work was neutral. It was the conditions around it that had been unjust, and the conditions were changing, and she was still here. On the second afternoon, she was in the kitchen helping with the preparations for the formal farewell dinner when Clara came in with flour on her hands from the bread she had been making at the other bench. "Are you actually going?" Clara said. It was the first time she had asked directly. "Yes," Mira said. Clara worked flour between her hands for a moment. "When?" "Within the month. After the formal arrangements are confirmed." She looked at Clara. "You knew it was coming." "Knowing it is coming, and having it arrive are different things," Clara said. There was something in her voice that was not reproach. It was the honest texture of someone who had developed an attachment and was being adult about what that attachment required of them. "I am not going to be unreachable," Mira said. "There will be correspondence. If something happens here, if you need me, or if someone does, the king's office will know where I am." Clara was quiet for a moment. "It is strange," she said, "that you came in here cleaning the floors, and you are leaving with the king's office, knowing where to find you." "It is strange," Mira agreed, "but the person doing the floors and the person leaving are the same person." Clara looked at her. "I know," she said. "That's the part I'm going to miss." Mira put down her spoon. She crossed to where Clara was, and she did something she had not done with another person in the Blackwood compound in 14 years. She put her arms around her, not with ceremony, not with explanation, just briefly, solidly, the way you hold something that matters. Clara made the same kind of sound she had made at the window during the bow. Then she pulled back and looked at the ceiling and said, "All right, go back to the cooking. You are going to make me do something embarrassing in the kitchen." Mira went back to the cooking. She was smiling, which she noted only because it was the kind of smiling that arrives without permission and is not self-conscious about it. The farewell dinner was the best the kitchen had produced in months. This was not an accident. She had been in the kitchen all afternoon, and the kitchen worked better when she was in it, not because of anything she did deliberately, but because of the ambient quality she had always carried and never named. Things settled. People worked at their best pace. The food tasted like itself, which was all good food needed to do. During the dinner, Oren said very little. He was present and correct and said what was required of him at formal meals, and he made no gesture toward Mira one way or the other. She did not expect him to. What she expected, and received, was the specific silence of a man who had been comprehensively outmaneuvered and understood it, and was already calculating the next available options. That was his nature. She was not going to change his nature. She had never tried to. What she had tried to change, and had changed, was the structure that gave his nature the authority to define her. That part was done. After the dinner, when the compound's guests had retired and the cleanup was complete, she went to the greenhouse one last time that night. She brought a lantern. She sat on her stool. She pressed her hands into the soil. She was going to travel with the plants once she had her plans clear. She had been thinking about this for weeks and had decided that the largest ones could be divided and taken to new soil, and that there was a greenhouse in the Northern Territory that she had been told about through correspondence, and that wanted for exactly the kind of tending she knew how to provide. She had also decided that some of them would stay, that this space would remain her space, in the formal record, and that when she returned, and she would return, it would be exactly as she had left it. She stayed in the greenhouse until the lantern was getting low. She went through each plant one by one, hands in the soil, the familiar current moving, and what she was doing with it was not healing, and not exactly growth either. It was something closer to a conversation between people who have been through something together and are saying goodbye with the understanding that goodbye is not permanent. She said, "Still here?" She said, "You too." Then she stood, and she carried the lantern out, and she closed the greenhouse door behind her. Not locked, never locked, just closed. And she walked through the compound in the dark and went to bed. In the morning, Cale Dre's party prepared to leave. She was in the courtyard. She was there in the same way she had been there the first time he had arrived, months ago, at the side of the space, with something in her hands, part of the compound's practical reality rather than its formal welcome line. The difference was that this time, he came to find her. He crossed the courtyard while Ada and the staff made the final preparations. He stopped in front of her with the same quality he had always brought to stopping in front of her. Present, specific, not performing anything. 2 weeks, he said, for the formal arrangements. 2 weeks, she agreed. He looked at her for a moment. How does it feel? He said. The morning after the document arrived. She thought about it. Like the beginning of something, she said. Which is new. My life has mostly felt like the continuation of something. He was quiet for a moment. Is that all right? Yes, she said. I think beginnings are something I am capable of. I just haven't had many. He nodded. He was looking at her with the expression that was the most personal one, the one that didn't belong to any official version of him, and she met it directly because she was done not meeting things directly. 2 weeks, he said again, not as a timeline. 2 weeks, she said, the same. He left. She watched the gate close behind his party and stood in the spring morning, in the courtyard, with the compound around her going about its day. She turned back toward the main building. She had work to do. She had a conversation to finish with Clara, and a formal record to help Den complete, and a list of things to arrange in the 2 weeks before the next part of her life began. She walked toward the door and she was already thinking about what came next, not anxiously, not with the particular forward lean of someone who wants to escape the present, just with the practical, steady attention of someone who knows what needs doing and is ready to do it. She passed the greenhouse on her way. She did not stop. She noted the closed door, the cleaned glass, the dark green shapes visible inside, the evidence of life that did not require her constant presence in order to continue. She walked on. The compound was behind her. The door to the main building was ahead of her. The spring air was cold and real, and full of the kind of light that comes after a long winter. Not bright, not warm yet, but unmistakably moving in the direction of both. She was 21 years old, and she had a name, and she knew what she was, and the door she was walking through was one she had opened herself. She went inside. She was already home, wherever she went.